Picture a Sunday evening in the early 1990s. The sky outside is going that particular shade of purple it only turns in autumn. The television is warm, the couch is familiar, and somewhere on the screen, a family is settling onto their own couch in a living room you feel like you've sat in 1,000 times before, even though it doesn't quite exist anywhere on any map. That's where we're going tonight. Down into Springfield. Down through 36 years of episodes, of characters and storylines and secrets buried so deep inside the fabric of this show that most people have walked over them every single week, without ever noticing the ground was hollow beneath their feet. This is the Simpsons Iceberg, and we're going all the way to the bottom. Get comfortable. There's no rush here. We're going to move through this slowly and carefully, the way you'd walk through a town at night, when everything is quiet and there's nothing left to do except notice things. Some of what we find will be familiar. Some of it will be strange. And some of it, by the time we reach the very bottom of this iceberg, will change the way you think about a show you've probably known your entire life. Let's start at the surface, where the water is warm and everything looks the way you remember it. Section 1. The surface. Things everyone knows. Treehouse of Horror. Every October, something happens in Springfield that the rest of the year pretends never occurred. The rules change. Characters die and stay dead, at least for a few minutes. Homer gets eaten by a lawnmower. Bart gets his head switched with a fly. The school principal transforms into a murderous babysitter who cooks children into soup. And then, when it's all over, the regular show resumes as if none of it happened. These are the Treehouse of Horror episodes, and they've been running since season 2, in 1990. At first glance, they seem like a simple seasonal tradition, the animated equivalent of putting up Halloween decorations. You do it every year because it's tradition, but the Treehouse of Horror episodes have quietly become something much more interesting than that. They started as a way to tell stories the show normally couldn't tell. The show's regular continuity had rules. Characters couldn't permanently die. Events had to reset. The emotional grounding of the Springfield world had to remain intact. But in the Treehouse of Horror, those rules evaporated. The writers could kill Bart. They could destroy the entire town. They could send Homer to a dimension where he becomes a live-action figure stumbling through a real New York street, bewildered and enormous, while real people stare at him. That moment actually happened, by the way. In Treehouse of Horror 6, there is a segment called Homer Cubed, in which Homer falls through a hole in Flanders' wall and ends up inside a three-dimensional computer-generated space that was, for 1995, genuinely stunning to look at. The animation team used early CGI technology that had never been seen in primetime television before. Homer wanders through a wireframe landscape, looks at the camera, and says something that still lands with a particular weight all these years later. He says he's going to get to a better place, and then the world collapses. The episode ends with Homer emerging not back in Springfield, but in real-world Hollywood. A live-action Homer, rubber suit and all, stumbling down a street lined with real shops and real people, utterly lost. It's played for laughs, but there's something lonely about it that stays with you longer than the joke does. Over the years, the Treehouse of Horror episodes developed their own internal structure. They are always split into 3 segments, usually based on classic horror stories or science fiction premises. The Raven, from the first Treehouse, had James Earl Jones narrating Edgar Allan Poe's poem, while Homer played the tormented narrator. Bart played the Raven. It was beautiful and strange, and unlike anything animated television had done before. As the show went on, the Treehouse episodes became a tradition that fans tracked with almost ritualistic attention. The question every October was which classic stories would be adapted, which characters would die, which segment would be the disturbing one. Because there was always a disturbing one. Even in years when the overall quality of the show was being debated by fans, the Treehouse episodes maintained a consistency that felt almost separate from the rest of the series, as if they were being made by a slightly different, slightly darker version of the same team. There's also something worth sitting with about how these episodes handle death. In the regular Simpsons universe, nobody truly dies. Characters who die in one episode appear in the next with no explanation. But in Treehouse of Horror, the deaths feel real within their segments. Homer is killed over and over. Bart is killed. The deaths are played with genuine dramatic weight, even when they're immediately followed by a punchline, and the audience sits with them differently than they would in a regular episode. Because for the duration of a Treehouse segment, you believe it. The rules say this can stick. The show could let it stick. It doesn't, but it could. And that possibility, that fragile sense that something real is on the line, is what makes these episodes feel like they exist slightly outside of ordinary time. There are 35 Treehouse of Horror episodes now, one for every season after the first. That's over 100 individual horror segments, each one its own contained nightmare or comedy or something in between. If you were to watch them all in sequence, back to back, you would see the show's relationship with darkness shift over the decades. The early episodes play their horror with genuine atmosphere. The middle seasons lean into parody. The recent ones tend toward absurdist comedy. But the tradition itself remains intact, and that might be the strangest thing about it. In a show that has changed enormously since 1989, Treehouse of Horror has stayed essentially the same. Every October, Springfield breaks its own rules. And every November, Springfield acts like nothing happened. That's the most Simpsons thing possible. The couch gag. Every episode of The Simpsons begins with a sequence that has become one of the most recognized pieces of television in history. The theme song plays. Springfield scrolls past. Various characters rush to the couch. And then something unexpected happens on that couch. Something different every single week. This is the couch gag. It runs for somewhere between 5 seconds and several minutes depending on the episode. It was invented partly because early episodes ran short, and the production team needed a flexible piece of animation that could be expanded or trimmed to fill time. The couch gag was a practical solution to a technical problem. But it evolved into something that writers and animators clearly loved, because the ambitions of the couch gag have grown far beyond anything a simple filler sequence would ever need to be. In the early seasons, the gags were simple. The family sits down and the couch falls through the floor. The family sits down and the couch collapses. An alien is already sitting on the couch when they arrive. These are elegant little jokes. 10 seconds of visual comedy that prime the audience for what's coming. But as the show continued, the couch gags became more elaborate, then more conceptually adventurous, then genuinely experimental. There is a couch gag by the animator Don Hertzfeldt that transforms the Simpsons family into something from a fever dream. Their faces melting and reforming, their voices distorting, the Springfield they inhabit fracturing into abstract shapes, while a digital voice recites fragments of dialogue that no character has ever spoken. It is deeply strange. It is not entirely comfortable to watch, and it ran on primetime network television in 2016, introduced with no warning, immediately before a regular episode about Homer getting into an argument with his neighbor. There are couch gags that run for 6 minutes and tell complete stories. There is a couch gag that recreates a Renaissance painting with the Simpsons family. There is one made entirely in the style of a Banksy installation, which was animated by Banksy himself, and included imagery so dark, depicting sweatshop workers producing Simpsons merchandise under brutal conditions, that there were genuine internal debates at Fox about whether it could air. It aired. Banksy later confirmed that the show's producers had been nervous about it, and that the segment had survived largely because the show had enough institutional power by that point to get away with almost anything. The couch gag has hosted animation styles from studios around the world. It has been used to honor deceased artists and acknowledge cultural moments. It has referenced everything from 2001, A Space Odyssey, to video game aesthetics to oil painting. It has, on several occasions, been more artistically ambitious than anything in the episode it preceded. And then the episode begins, and Homer falls down some stairs, and Bart writes something on the chalkboard, and Springfield resumes its comfortable rhythm. The couch gag is the show taking a breath before it goes back to being itself. Sometimes that breath is 30 seconds. Sometimes it's 6 minutes. Sometimes it's one of the most quietly radical pieces of animation to have aired on American network television. Every single week for 36 years. That's a lot of couches. Guest stars. There is a moment in Season 3 when Michael Jackson calls Homer Simpson. Not an actor playing Michael Jackson, not a character inspired by Michael Jackson. The actual Michael Jackson, at the actual height of his fame, calling Homer on the phone and then spending an entire episode as a large, gentle man named Leon Kompowski, who believes he is Michael Jackson, and who helps Bart write a birthday song for Lisa. Michael Jackson is credited on that episode under the pseudonym John J. Smith. His speaking voice is genuinely him. His singing, in the small section where the character actually sings, is performed by a sound-alike. But his presence, his warmth and calm and strange sweetness in that episode, is real. He reportedly pursued the role. He loved The Simpsons. He wanted to be on it, and the show let him do it in this quiet, almost hidden way, under a false name, in a role that gave him permission to be something other than what the world expected him to be. That episode captures something true about what guest stars meant to The Simpsons in its early seasons. The show wasn't using celebrities as billboards. It was giving them a place to be interesting. It was writing roles that reflected something specific about who these people were, or who they might secretly want to be, and then trusting the audience to sit with the strangeness of seeing a world-famous icon reduced, or perhaps expanded, into a character in a cartoon about a working-class family in an unnamed American town. The list of guests in the first 10 seasons reads like a catalog of late 20th century American culture. Paul and Linda McCartney, Johnny Cash, Meryl Streep, Albert Brooks, who appeared multiple times under the name A. Brooks, and whose performances as Hank Scorpio and Brad Goodman are widely considered among the greatest guest turns in television history. Elizabeth Taylor, who spoke Maggie's first word. The musicians Sonic Youth appeared. Stephen Hawking appeared, and returned multiple times, always as a version of himself that was sharper and funnier than any other medium had allowed him to be. What made these appearances work was specificity. The writers weren't simply inserting famous names into generic situations. They were writing stories that required exactly this person, at exactly this moment, doing exactly this thing. When Kelsey Grammer first appeared as Sideshow Bob, he was playing a character who had attempted to frame Krusty the Clown for armed robbery, and who, in prison, had learned to cultivate an air of wounded aristocracy. That character required an actor with enough comedic intelligence to play villainy as a form of wounded pride. Grammer understood immediately. He has returned to the role many times since. Each return adds another layer to a character who began as a one-episode joke and became one of the most elaborately developed supporting characters in the show's history. The guest star tradition eventually became something the show was known for, perhaps too known for. In later seasons, the arrivals of famous faces began to feel more like events than stories. The show would announce a guest, fans would anticipate it, the episode would arrive, and the celebrity would play a version of themselves that was just recognizable enough to generate a headline. The craft that had once made the guest appearances feel essential began to fade. But the best of them, the early ones, the unexpected ones, remain remarkable. They are time capsules of a particular moment in American culture, captured inside a cartoon, preserved in amber, impossible to replicate now that the world has changed around them. The donut. Homer Simpson's relationship with donuts is one of the most purely pleasurable comedic bits in the history of the medium. It requires no explanation. Homer sees a donut. Homer wants the donut. Homer eats the donut, with an ecstasy so total that it briefly displaces everything else from his consciousness. This is funny on its own terms, but it also functions as a perfect visual shorthand for Homer's entire emotional architecture, the way deep pleasure and absolute present-tense absorption in small things coexist. In him, with a life that is often difficult, often painful, and often too complicated for him to fully understand. The donut is not just a food Homer likes. The donut is what happens when Homer encounters something the world cannot take away from him in the moment of having it. He may be humiliated at work. He may be failing as a husband. He may have made a catastrophic decision that will take 3 acts to resolve. But right now, there is a donut, and the donut is perfect. The show understands this, and uses it with remarkable precision. The best Homer eating donuts moments are not simply him being gluttonous. They are moments of almost philosophical relief. The famous Devil and Homer Simpson segment from Treehouse of Horror 4 hinges on this entirely. Homer sells his soul to the devil for a single donut. He knows, intellectually, that this is a bad trade. He eats the donut anyway. The devil returns to collect, and Homer is only saved through a legal technicality involving the fact that he is married to Marge, and therefore his soul belongs to her first. But the key moment, the one that makes the segment work as something other than just a parody of the Faust story, is Homer's face when he eats that donut. There is no regret in it. There is only the donut. Some pleasures, the show seems to be saying, are worth the consequences. Or at least, Homer genuinely cannot imagine a version of himself that would choose differently, even knowing what he knows. The pink frosted donut with sprinkles that Homer is most commonly associated with has, over the years, become a genuine cultural object. It appears on merchandise, on posters, in art installations, on birthday cakes. It was placed on the cover of magazines. It has been recreated in real-world bakeries on every continent. The particular shade of pink, the specific arrangement of rainbow sprinkles, the glossy simplicity of it, has become one of the most instantly recognizable food images in the world. And it started as a gag about a man who cannot resist eating things. That transformation, from throwaway joke to cultural icon, is something The Simpsons has done more than any other show in history. It takes a small, specific human thing, a love of donuts, a fear of being forgotten by your boss, a complicated relationship with a father who doesn't know how to say he loves you, and it repeats it until it becomes archetypal, until it stops being Homer's thing and becomes everyone's thing, until you see a pink donut and you feel something that is not quite nostalgia and not quite humor but somewhere between them, something warm. Something that asks you to remember a time when Sunday evening television was the most reliable comfort in the world. And now, before we go deeper, a quick pause. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It doesn't matter if it's 2 in the morning in a bedroom somewhere quiet, or 3 in the afternoon on a slow day. There's something genuinely nice about knowing that people all over the world are settling in with Springfield right now, at completely different hours, in completely different weathers. Drop your location and time in the comments. And if you're enjoying this so far, consider subscribing. There's a lot more iceberg beneath us, and we're only just beginning to descend. Section 2. The Curious Fan Layer. Things you probably know if you paid attention. Sideshow Bob and the obsession that defined a character. Let's begin with a question that is, on the surface, absurd. Why does a classically educated man with a voice like velvet and the cultural refinement of a 19th century European aristocrat keep trying to murder an 11-year-old boy? That's Sideshow Bob. Or more precisely, that's Robert Underdunk Turwilliger Jr., Doctor of Literature from Yale University, former assistant to a children's television clown, and the most elaborately motivated recurring antagonist in animated television history. When Bob first appeared in Krusty Gets Busted in Season 1, he was a simple villain. Krusty the Clown's assistant, previously played for visual comedy due to his enormous feet and volcanic hair, had framed his employer for armed robbery so he could take over the show and replace it with high-culture programming. It was a sharp, focused joke about the tension between lowbrow entertainment and intellectual pretension. Bob was the snob who thought he deserved the spotlight. He was caught. He went to jail. That should have been the end of it. But Kelsey Grammer's performance had done something the writers hadn't fully anticipated. He'd given Bob a sense of wounded dignity that was genuinely funny without ever being entirely comedic. There was something real underneath Bob's theatrical villainy. A kind of genuine pain at being born into a world that would rather watch Krusty get hit in the face with a pie than sit through a production of Die Fledermaus. The audience felt it, the writers felt it, and so Bob returned. In Black Widower, Season 3, Bob married Selma Bouvier, Marge's sister, specifically to kill her for her inheritance. The plan was foiled by Bart, who remembered a detail from a MacGyver episode that allowed him to identify the murder method before it happened. Bob was sent back to prison. But now the show had established something. Bob and Bart had a genuine adversarial relationship built on history, on humiliation, on Bob's bottomless inability to accept defeat from a child he considered his intellectual inferior. Cape Fear, Season 5, is where this dynamic reached its defining expression. The episode is a direct parody of Cape Fear, the 1962 and 1991 thriller about a convict who terrorizes the family of the man who put him away. Bob, released from prison, begins systematically stalking the Simpsons family, eventually chasing them onto a houseboat on a river. The final confrontation between Bob and Bart on the houseboat is one of the most perfectly constructed comedic sequences in the show's history. Bob has Bart at his mercy. He is about to kill him. And Bart, buying time, asks Bob if he'll grant him one final wish and sing the entire score of the HMS Pinafore by Gilbert and Sullivan. Bob considers this. His love of culture is genuine. His ego is enormous. He cannot resist. And he sings the entire thing. The complete operetta, standing on a houseboat in the middle of a river while the Simpsons escape. It takes so long that the houseboat drifts into a dock. Police are waiting. Bob is arrested again. His love of art has defeated him more completely than any tactical error could have. It's genuinely a perfect joke, but it also tells you something real about Bob that everything that follows depends on. He could have simply killed Bart. He chose to perform. That choice, made in the moment, from genuine vanity and genuine love of music, is the most honest thing about him. He is not, underneath the murderous intent, a practical man. He is an artist who took a wrong turn somewhere and ended up becoming a cartoon villain. And he is constitutionally unable to stop being an artist, even when it costs him everything he wants. The show would return to this dynamic many times. Bob ran for mayor. Bob worked as a TV presenter in Italy. Bob was freed, recaptured, freed again, fell in love, had a son, helped defeat another villain more dangerous than himself, and at one point actually succeeded in killing Bart, only for the show to reset the timeline almost immediately. Each visit deepens something. Bob is not simply a villain. He is the show's meditation on what happens when intelligence and culture and genuine aesthetic passion are put in service of something petty. He is what snobbery looks like when it turns malevolent. And every time he appears, every time that voice fills the room and those enormous feet shuffle into frame, there is something almost affectionate in how the show handles him. Springfield needs Bob. Bob needs Springfield. Bart needs Bob. The hatred between them has become, over 36 years, almost a form of love. The kind that cannot be spoken. The kind that keeps showing up at the door, no matter how many times you call the police. Homer's weight and what it actually means. There's a number that floats through The Simpsons in a way that most viewers absorb without really examining. That number is 239 pounds. It's Homer's weight. Or more precisely, it's the weight that Homer cites in specific episodes, and that the show has used as a reference point across various storylines about Homer's relationship with food, with his body, with physical effort. But here's the thing. The show's treatment of Homer's weight has changed enormously over 36 seasons, in a way that mirrors something real about how American culture has talked about weight and bodies during the same period. In the early seasons, Homer's size was simply a physical characteristic. He was a large man. He ate too much. This was the baseline. The humor around it was observational rather than judgmental. There were fat jokes, certainly, but they came from a place that understood Homer's size as part of his overall character, rather than as a separate problem to be diagnosed or solved. He was big the way he was bald. It was part of him. Then, in season 4, something shifted. Homer's weight became a story point in a new way in King Size Homer, an episode from season 7 actually, in which Homer discovers that by reaching a certain weight threshold, he can qualify as clinically disabled and work from home. He deliberately gains weight, not as a character flaw, but as a calculated strategy. He researches, he plans, he succeeds. The episode takes the premise seriously enough to follow its logic all the way through, showing Homer happy in his enormous body, pleased with the trade-offs he's made, genuinely content with a life that involves less effort and more donuts. And then the plot requires him to prevent a nuclear meltdown, and the episode ends with Burns paying to have Homer's stomach stapled back to its original size, and everything resets. The episode was, at the time, considered a sharp piece of satire about disability policy and workplace accommodation. See, watching it now, it contains an additional layer. Homer is not ashamed of his large body in this episode. He is tactical about it. He uses it. He enjoys it. The show doesn't frame his happiness in that larger body as delusion or self-deception. It frames it as Homer being, in his own terms, successful. The resolution, where the weight is surgically removed as a reward from Burns, is played as comedy. But it's also slightly troubling. Homer was happy. The show took that away. Later seasons became more explicit about Homer's weight in ways that felt less comfortable. The jokes became cruder. Homer's size was treated as grotesque rather than simply large. The warmth with which the early show had regarded his appetite, that sense of genuine pleasure in the donut, began to be replaced by something more contemptuous. Homer's body went from being part of who he was to being treated as a problem he carried around with him. This shift is worth noting, not as a criticism of the show specifically, but as a reflection of something that happened in American culture broadly during the same period. The early 90s handled weight with a particular casualness that the late 90s and 2000s replaced with something more medicalized, more moralized, more anxious. The Simpsons, which has always functioned as an inadvertent cultural diary, recorded this shift in the way it drew and wrote Homer's body. You can track a change in American attitudes by watching how the show's Homer jokes evolved across 2 decades. The number 239 pounds, when it appears, carries all of that with it. It's not just a number. It's a record of how a culture taught itself to feel about size, projected onto a yellow cartoon man who mostly just wants to eat a donut in peace. Barney's transformation. For the first 8 or so seasons of The Simpsons, Barney Gumble was a specific kind of joke. He was Homer's best friend, a man who had once been Homer's intellectual equal, perhaps even his superior, until alcohol had taken everything that intelligence might have built and replaced it with an endless afternoon in a bar stool. Barney belched. Barney stumbled. Barney occasionally revealed, in a single unguarded moment, the person he might have been, a flash of sensitivity or unexpected skill, before the joke reset and he returned to the bar stool. The most famous of these flashes is Plow King, from the Season 4 episode Homer vs. Patty and Selma, where Barney reveals he can play the French horn with startling beauty. The moment is played straight, the music is genuinely moving, and then it ends, and Barney resumes being Barney, and the show continues. These small moments were a consistent tool. They prevented Barney from becoming purely a caricature. They kept alive the ghost of what he'd been, or what he'd never gotten to become. Then in Season 11, the episode Days of Wine and Dioses changed Barney in a way the show initially committed to fully. Barney got sober. He confronted his alcoholism. He went through withdrawal. He found himself on the other side of it, clear-eyed and functional and genuinely different. The episode was sensitive about what recovery actually looks like. It showed Barney grieving the loss of his identity as a drunk, which sounds paradoxical but is psychologically accurate. He had built an entire sense of self around Moe's Tavern, around his relationship with the other drinkers, around being the specific kind of sad and funny that only works when you're never quite present. Sober Barney was uncertain in a new way. He had to figure out who he was. The show appeared to be committing to this change. Sober Barney appeared in subsequent episodes. He was learning to helicopter. He was making documentary films. He was, genuinely, becoming someone. And then the show slowly, quietly walked it back. Not in a single episode. Not with any explanation. Barney simply began appearing at Moe's again. Drinking again. Being the old Barney again. No announcement, no relapse episode, no acknowledgement that the transformation had ever happened. It just stopped being true. This might be the clearest possible example of the show's relationship with character growth, and it's worth sitting with. The show can imagine its characters becoming different people. It can write those transformations with real care and emotional honesty, and then it can undo them entirely, simply by refusing to acknowledge they happened. Springfield's collective amnesia, which we talked about in the first section, is not only a backdrop, it operates on the characters themselves. Barney did not have a relapse, at least not on screen. Barney simply stopped having gotten sober, as if the episode existed in a sealed pocket of time that the rest of the show agreed not to open. For a show that has so many moments of genuine emotional depth, this ability to erase its own character work is one of its most consistent and, if you look at it directly, most quietly unsettling features. It suggests that in Springfield, growth is always optional. You can become someone different for 22 minutes, and then you can simply choose not to have become them. The choice requires no effort and no explanation. The town will absorb it, the way it absorbs everything. Quietly, completely, and without leaving a mark. The Springfield location mystery. There are 48 different real American towns named Springfield. That's the number the show itself cites when it wants to deflect the question of where its Springfield sits. The joke is that the name is so common it provides cover. If every state has a Springfield, no one can be sure which one the show means. But the deeper truth is that The Simpsons has spent 36 years not simply hiding Springfield's location, but actively constructing its impossibility. The town has been placed in different states in different episodes with such frequency and such apparent deliberateness that the contradictions cannot be explained as errors. They are the point. In one episode, Springfield is clearly in a mountainous western state. In another, it has a warm, humid climate. In a third, it's landlocked. In a fourth, it has a harbor. In a fifth, it borders 3 other states whose identities shift depending on the scene. The town's geographic situation is genuinely incoherent when you try to map it, and a number of devoted fans have tried to map it, with detailed analyses that cross-reference elevation, climate, neighboring state names partially visible on maps, the direction of shadows, and the types of trees visible through windows. None of these analyses have succeeded in pinning Springfield to a single real location. Every analysis eventually breaks down somewhere. Every candidate state turns out to lack a feature the show has clearly established. Matt Groening has spoken about this directly. He has said that Springfield was named after the Springfield in Oregon because he grew up near it. But he also deliberately made the town's location impossible to identify, because he wanted every viewer to feel like Springfield could be their town. Not just in the sense of its social dynamics or its class composition, but literally, geographically. He wanted the town to be near you no matter where you lived. This is, as a design decision, genuinely interesting. Most fictional towns anchor themselves. Fictional New York is still New York. Fictional small-town America usually lives in a specific region, with specific weather and specific cultural markers. Springfield refuses this. It is everywhere. It is the town that exists wherever you need it to exist, which means it has something in common with places that only exist in dreams. Places that feel completely real while you're in them and dissolve into pure impression the moment you try to describe their location. We'll come back to what that means when we go deeper into the iceberg. For now, it's enough to know that the mystery is intentional, it is maintained, and it is one of the most quietly sophisticated things the show has ever done. Section 3. The Dedicated Viewer. Things that change the show forever. Frank Grimes and the show's mirror. There are episodes of The Simpsons that seem, on the surface, to be individual stories about individual characters in individual situations. And then there are episodes that are actually about something else entirely. Episodes that are using their premise to interrogate something fundamental about the show's universe and its audience's relationship to it. Homer's Enemy, from Season 8, is the most pure example of this. It is the show turning to face itself. The premise is simple. A new employee named Frank Grimes arrives at the Springfield nuclear power plant. Frank is everything Homer is not. He worked hard his entire life. He earned his education through sacrifice and night school and genuine effort. He is competent at his job. He cares about doing things correctly. He has no patience for Homer's perpetual incompetence, his constant destruction of equipment, his bizarre luck and inexplicable survival. And Frank Grimes, over the course of the episode, is driven to madness, and then to death, by the experience of watching Homer Simpson exist. The joke is that Frank is correct. Homer is objectively terrible at his job, and at almost everything he puts his hand to, and he suffers no consequences for any of it. He has a house and a family and a car and a social life and food on the table, all of it sustained by a universe that has decided Homer will be comfortable regardless of what Homer does. Frank Grimes, who has done everything right and sacrificed everything to earn the things Homer was simply given, cannot bear this. He ends the episode mimicking Homer's carelessness, as a way of showing the world how insane it is to reward that carelessness, and he is electrocuted by a live cable he touches because he knows Homer would survive it. Homer sleeps through the funeral. The episode was, at the time of its airing, controversial among the show's own creative team. Some writers felt it was too dark. Some felt it was genuinely uncomfortable in a way that undermined the audience's ability to love Homer. If you make the case too strongly that Homer is a destructive, undeserving man who floats through life on unearned grace, you have to reckon with what that means for 36 years of rooting for him. But that discomfort is the point. Homer's Enemy is the show acknowledging, directly, that its protagonist makes no logical sense within any system that connects effort to reward. Frank Grimes is every person who has ever watched the show and thought, correctly, that this man should not be okay, and is clearly going to be okay anyway. The show is asking you whether you can still love Homer, after it has made the case against him as clearly as possible. And the answer, for most viewers, remains yes. Because what Frank Grimes lacks, despite being correct about almost everything, is the quality that makes Homer watchable through decades of failure. Frank Grimes cannot absorb joy. Homer cannot absorb defeat. And in that asymmetry, the show suggests, lies something true about why we watch. We don't watch Homer because he earns his happiness. We watch him because his happiness is unconditional. The Maude Flanders death. Some creative decisions in television exist because the story requires them. Some exist because the production does. The death of Maude Flanders, in Season 11, falls into the second category, and the show's handling of it has been discussed and debated by fans ever since. Maude Flanders was Ned's wife. She was a gentle, faith-driven woman who appeared regularly through the first 10 seasons as part of the background texture of Springfield, specifically of the Simpsons' immediate neighborhood. She was not a central character. She was not given elaborate storylines. But she was present, consistently and recognizably, as part of the domestic world the show had built. She and Ned were a unit. They were the counter-image to Homer and Marge, the version of a Springfield marriage that looked, from the outside, more serene and more functional. The circumstances of her death involve real off-screen events that changed the show's behind-the-scenes situation. Maggie Roswell, the actress who voiced Maude, was in a contract dispute with Fox over travel expenses related to recording her lines from a home studio. The dispute was not resolved. Roswell left the show. The production team made the decision to kill the character, rather than simply recast her or write her out quietly. Maude's death, in the episode Alone Again, Natura Diddley, is the result of Homer dodging T-shirts fired by a mascot cannon at a racing event. The shirts miss Homer and hit Maude, knocking her from the bleachers. She is killed, essentially, by Homer's reflexive self-preservation, not through any malice, simply because Homer moved, and Maude happened to be behind him. The episode that followed explored Ned's grief with a seriousness that the show hadn't fully prepared the audience for. Ned is devastated. The episode does not play his loss for comedy. It gives him space to fall apart. And then it sets him on the path to eventually finding connection again, which the show would explore in subsequent seasons as Ned navigated widowhood with his children. But the manner of Maude's death, and its origin in a contract dispute, creates a strange texture around the whole thing. The show's universe decided that a good woman died because a contract negotiation failed. The production reality leaked into the story and left a mark that never quite washed out. Every time Ned's grief appears afterward, every time the show acknowledges the empty space in his house, the audience sits with both the fictional loss and the real one. The sense that a character who should have had more time was pulled out of the story before the story was ready to release her. It is one of the cleaner examples of the way production decisions shape narrative, often in ways that are invisible to casual viewers, but that leave traces in the emotional texture of the stories being told. Cape Fear, the episode that broke the record. Most episodes of The Simpsons have a rake gag. Cape Fear has 11 of them. This sounds like a trivial detail until you understand what it means about how television comedy works and how The Simpsons understood its own rhythms with a precision that was, in this episode, almost scientific. The rake gag comes from a sequence in which Sideshow Bob is walking through a yard and repeatedly steps on a rake that hits him in the face. It happens once, which is funny. It happens again, which is confusing. It continues happening 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 times, until the joke has moved through every stage of comedy response: initial laugh, growing bewilderment, the comedy of duration, the comedy of the gag refusing to end, and finally something that is almost beyond comedy, a kind of pure, sustained absurdity that has outlasted your normal expectations of what a gag is allowed to be. The sequence was not accidental. The writers had learned, through years of producing comedy under tight time constraints, that the length of a gag determines its character. A short gag is a joke. A medium gag is a sketch. A long gag, held past the point where you expect it to end, becomes something philosophically interesting. It starts to ask questions about why you're still watching, about what you're waiting for, about whether the joke is the thing that's happening or the fact that it keeps happening. Cape Fear used this understanding throughout. The episode is technically a parody of a thriller, but it holds that premise at a distance, using it as scaffolding for a sustained meditation on the comedy of escalation. Sideshow Bob's menace keeps building. The family's fear keeps building. The rake keeps hitting. And by the time you reach the houseboat and the operetta, the episode has trained you to expect that any given bit will go on considerably longer than you initially thought possible. The episode is widely considered one of the 5 or 10 greatest episodes the show has produced. It succeeds because it trusts its audience's patience while rewarding it continuously. Every long gag in Cape Fear earns its length. Nothing is padded. The duration is the joke, and the joke knows exactly when to stop, which, in Season 5, the show did with remarkable consistency. It knew when to stop. That knowledge, that confident sense of a joke's correct duration, is one of the many things that gradually departed as the show continued. But in Cape Fear, it was perfect. 11 rakes. Count them if you ever watch it again. Section 4. Deep Cuts, Forgotten Episodes, and Buried Brilliance. Behind the Laughter. There is one episode of The Simpsons that asks you to take the show apart and look at its machinery. It aired in Season 11, in the year 2000, and it is called Behind the Laughter. It is presented as a documentary in the style of VH1's Behind the Music series, which was, at the time, one of the most popular formats on television for examining the self-destruction of music acts. The conceit of Behind the Laughter is that the Simpsons family is a real family who became famous by allowing cameras into their home, and that the show we've been watching for 11 years is that documentary footage. The episode then subjects this fictional premise to the behind-the-music treatment, complete with dramatic narrator voiceover, talking head interviews with the family, and a narrative arc of rise, excess, breakdown, and attempted reconciliation. The episode works because it commits entirely to its premise, while simultaneously being very funny about what that premise requires. Homer, as an interviewee, reveals things that make no sense. Marge discusses the show's production in ways that contradict everything the audience knows. The family's conflicts are presented as entertainment industry feuds, with Homer going on a painkiller binge after an injury, and Marge hiring a personal manager who nearly broke the family apart. But underneath the comedy is something genuinely interesting. Behind the laughter is the show asking itself what it is. Is it a documentary? Is it a fiction? Is the family real or performed? And the answer the episode gives, with characteristic Simpsons evasiveness, is both, and neither, and also somehow yes. The episode ends with the family reconciling and continuing the show, which the narrator frames as a renewal. But the renewal rings slightly false, because you've just watched the show deconstruct itself for 20 minutes. The scaffolding is visible, the seams are showing, and then the credits roll, and next week another episode airs as if none of it happened. Behind the Laughter is also notable for a piece of trivia that varies depending on where you watched it. In its original broadcast, the narrator identified the family as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed to Tennessee. The episode that explicitly claims to reveal the truth about the Simpsons family has different truths depending on which version you watch. Even in its most apparently revelatory moment, the show hedged. Even when it pointed at a specific answer, it left a different door open. That might be the most Simpsons thing of all. Stark Raving Dad. The episode is called Stark Raving Dad. It aired in the 3rd season. A very large, very gentle man named Leon Kompowski is introduced as Homer's new mental hospital roommate. Leon believes he is Michael Jackson. He has adopted Michael Jackson's mannerisms, his speaking patterns, his warmth. He is played as entirely sincere, not as a delusional person who is frightening, but as someone who has found something to inhabit that gives him peace. What makes this episode remarkable, beyond the Michael Jackson element discussed earlier, is its treatment of Lisa's birthday. Bart has forgotten it. He has made no plans, purchased no gift, remembered nothing. Lisa, who is 8 years old and perceptive in the specific way that makes you aware of every adult's slight even when they don't realize they've slighted you, is genuinely hurt. She doesn't make a scene. She doesn't ask for anything. She goes through the motions of not caring while clearly caring a great deal. And then Bart, with Leon's help, writes a song. It's a simple song. It's the kind of birthday song a kid would write. A little off, a little earnest, nothing technically impressive, but it's made for her. It knows the specific things about her, that she loves her saxophone, that she wants to change the world, that her family sometimes fails to see her. It's the kind of gift that could only come from someone who actually paid attention. The scene where Lisa receives the song, where she hears Bart singing it at the door in the middle of the night, is one of the most quietly devastating things the show has ever produced. Nothing explodes. Nobody falls down. There is just a sister hearing her brother do something that cost him something, and the knowledge, given and received, that they see each other. The episode ends with Leon leaving, the Michael Jackson persona set aside. He says quietly that he's been cured. The power of making someone happy has given him something he didn't have before. He walks off into the ordinary world. The next episode, Homer has no memory of any of this. Leon is never mentioned again. The song, however, was real enough that people have been covering it for 30 years. The Season 9 debate. There is a demarcation in Simpsons fan culture that functions almost like a geological boundary. On one side is the Golden Age. On the other is what fans call the decline. The line between them has been placed in different seasons by different analysts, but a significant portion of the fan base points to Season 9 as the moment something changed. Season 9 aired in 1997 and 1998. It contains Principal and the Pauper, which we discussed earlier. It contains The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, which is a genuinely excellent episode that was temporarily pulled from syndication after September 11, 2001, due to its extended sequences in and around the Twin Towers. It contains The Cartridge Family, in which Homer buys a gun and the show handles the politics of gun ownership with a deftness that remained remarkable for years after. So Season 9 is not uniformly bad, but it is the season in which the show's relationship with its own continuity began to feel different. Episodes started to contain moments that were purely absurdist, without the emotional grounding that the earlier seasons had used to anchor their absurdity. Homer began to behave in ways that felt disconnected from the accumulated characterization of the previous 8 years. The show's satirical targets became broader and less specific. The comedy became louder. The Principal and the Pauper episode, which we discussed in the context of Springfield's relationship with truth and denial, is the most common exhibit in arguments about when the show started to change. Writer Ken Levine, who was not on the show at the time, but is a respected television figure, wrote a detailed analysis of why he believed the episode represented a fundamental break with what the show had been. His argument was essentially that the show had, until then, honored its own internal logic, even while being absurdist. Principal Skinner's character had been built over 8 seasons. The episode discarded that character and replaced it with someone new, and then tried to restore the original character at the end, through an act of community will, rather than through anything that actually made narrative sense. The debate about when The Simpsons declined, whether it was Season 9, or 11, or 13, or somewhere else, is ultimately a conversation about what the show was for, and whether it remained that thing. Different viewers have different answers. Some people who started watching in the later seasons see the early seasons as too slow, too dry, too focused on mundane domestic situations. Some people who grew up with the early seasons cannot engage with anything after Season 9. Both groups are watching the same show. They are measuring it against different ideas of what it should be. What's interesting is that the decline is not the end. The show has continued to produce individual episodes of remarkable quality well into its later seasons. The debate about decline is really a debate about consistency, about whether the show's floor dropped even as its ceiling sometimes remained high. That question has a different answer depending on how much of the show you've watched, in what order, and at what age. The spin-off showcase. There is an episode of The Simpsons in which The Simpsons proposes that it be turned into 3 other television shows. The episode is called The Simpsons Spin-off Showcase, and it aired in 1997. Troy McClure hosts. He introduces 3 pilot presentations for fictional spin-offs, each one a parody of a different television genre. The first is a buddy cop show, in which Chief Wiggum has been relocated to New Orleans and solves crimes with an unexpectedly competent partner, while a musical number plays. The second is a panel discussion variety show in which Homer's DNA has been accidentally combined with every other cast member, creating a single entity that can transform at will, and is hosting a variety program for some reason. So 4. The third is a reality-adjacent show following Lovejoy and his wife in Flanders in vaguely sitcom-shaped scenarios. Each parody is specific and sharp. The Wiggum Show captures something precise about the genre of cop procedurals set in colorful cities, the New Orleans setting doing exactly the work that setting does in real shows, lending a veneer of cultural richness to an otherwise formulaic structure. The Homer Kills segment is a parody of the kind of variety show that American television was trying to revive in the mid-90s. The Lovejoy segment is a parody of shows built on a premise too thin to sustain itself. But the episode is, underneath its comedy, a meditation on spin-offs, on what it means to take a successful property and attempt to reassemble its components into something new, on the fact that what makes The Simpsons work is not any individual character or situation, but the specific ecosystem of all of them together. Chief Wiggum without Springfield is a different kind of character. Flanders without Homer next door loses half of what defines him. The show knows this and says it in the form of three affectionate parodies of the very idea that any of these characters could work independently. The episode was also, in retrospect, a gentle acknowledgement of the pressures that any long-running successful show faces from its network. Fox wanted more Simpsons. They wanted it in different forms. The show's way of addressing this was to produce a full episode that was, technically, a parody of the concept of giving Fox what it wanted, while giving Fox something entirely different and much stranger. The pilot presentations were never made into real shows. The episode stands on its own as a beautiful piece of comedic metacomentary, a show using its own format to examine its own format, dressed up as something silly about Troy McClure in a blazer. Section 5. The Lore Layer. The show before the show. The Ullman Shorts. Before there was The Simpsons, there was a version of The Simpsons that looked almost nothing like the show the world came to know. From 1987 to 1989, short animated segments featuring the Simpsons family aired on The Tracy Ullman Show, a sketch comedy program on Fox. These shorts were created by Matt Groening and animated by Klasky Csupo, the studio that would go on to produce the early seasons of the full series. The Ullman shorts are startling to watch if you come to them after years of familiarity with the show they became. The character designs are rough and physically strange in a different way than the final show. Homer and Marge have exaggerated features that feel more overtly grotesque, less settled into a stable visual language. Bart and Lisa are recognizable, but not quite the same people. The animation is cheaper, looser, less consistent. The tone is rawer. The shorts were typically around 2 minutes long and usually depicted a single domestic situation: bedtime, dentist visits, car trips, homework. They were observational in a way that the later show sometimes was and sometimes wasn't. They watched a family interact with each other and with ordinary situations and found the comedy in the specific texture of those interactions rather than in escalating plot machinery. What's interesting about the shorts is not simply that they are early sketches of something that became famous. It's that they represent an alternate version of what The Simpsons could have been. The show that grew out of these shorts made choices. It developed a visual language, a narrative style, a way of treating its characters that became defining. But the shorts suggest that those choices were not inevitable. The Simpsons could have stayed smaller. It could have remained a domestic observational comedy about a family getting ready for bed. The escalation into something much bigger and stranger, into the space adventures and celebrity encounters and grand conspiracies, was a choice. The shorts remind you that it was a choice by showing you what the road not taken looks like. Groening has spoken about the shorts with a mixture of nostalgia and mild embarrassment. The animation quality was not what he had hoped for. He had drawn the characters in a certain way, and the animation process had not fully captured what he'd intended. But the family was there. The dynamics were there. Homer's stubbornness and Marge's patience and Bart's irreverence and Lisa's solemnity were already present in rough form, like a sketch that contains all the compositional decisions of a finished painting, but lacks its resolution and color. The shorts are also notable for containing content that would not be possible in the later show. The family is rougher with each other in the shorts, less cushioned by the warmth that the series developed. Homer is cruder, Bart is meaner. The edges haven't been sanded. Whether that rawness is a feature or a limitation depends on what you value in the show. But it is genuinely different, and it represents a creative moment before the show had decided, or perhaps before it had been required, by network standards and audience expectations to decide what it was going to be. Matt Groening's Life in Springfield. The Simpsons is named after a real family. Matt Groening's father was Homer. His mother was Margaret, known as Marge. His sisters were Lisa and Maggie. He named the family after his own family, in a kind of barely concealed personal act of creation, the animator drawing his own relatives into existence, as cartoon characters, and then giving them to the world. This biographical grounding is part of why the show's emotional core feels real, in a way that distinguishes it from most animated television. Groening was writing, in some indirect but genuine sense, about his own family. Not literally, not autobiographically, but the emotional architecture of what it feels like to grow up in a house with specific people who love each other in specific ways, with specific tensions and specific warmths, was something he knew from the inside. Bart is widely understood to be partly autobiographical. Groening was a mischievous kid. He had a complicated relationship with his father. He felt, at various points, like someone who was not living up to expectations, and who found in transgression and comedy a way of dealing with that feeling. Bart carries this. His relationship with Homer is partly, underneath the strangulation gags and the pranks, a portrait of a kind of father-son dynamic that many people recognize. The love is real. The frustration is real. The mutual incomprehension is real. The fact that it keeps resolving, that Homer keeps coming back to Bart in moments of crisis, keeps being, when it matters, the father he doesn't know how to be in ordinary time, feels drawn from something true. Springfield, Oregon, the real town, has embraced its connection to the show with varying degrees of enthusiasm over the years. It's a mid-sized city with a paper mill and a history that does not especially resemble the show's Springfield. But it exists. And knowing it exists adds something to the experience of watching the show. A small anchor in the real world. A sense that underneath all the impossibility and the floating timelines and the radiation and the philosophy, there is a man named Matt who had a father named Homer and a mother named Marge. And he thought about them one day while waiting to pitch a show to a network. And he gave them yellow skin and 4 fingers and an eternal present. And in doing so, accidentally made them immortal. There is something about that origin that feels important whenever the show does its best work. The work that makes you feel, for 22 minutes, that you are inside a real family's real house. Watching people who matter to each other struggle with the specific difficulties of mattering to each other. That feeling comes from somewhere true. It was drawn from life. The writer's room. The Simpsons writer's room in its early seasons was, by most accounts, one of the strangest and most productive creative environments in television history. The room contained people from backgrounds that had rarely, if ever, been combined in a television comedy context. Mathematicians, Harvard-educated literary scholars, former stand-up comedians, published novelists, professional animators, scientists. The mathematical precision of the show's early comedy, its rigorous understanding of setup and payoff, its willingness to plant jokes that didn't pay off until 5 minutes later or 5 episodes later, reflected the room's unusual composition. Writers with mathematics backgrounds brought a structural sensibility to comedy construction that produced jokes with an almost architectural quality. The payoff was never arbitrary. The foreshadowing was always functional. Every element that entered a story did work. John Swartzwelder wrote more Simpsons scripts than any other person, somewhere in the neighborhood of 59. He is also one of the most reclusive figures in television history. He almost never gives interviews. He does not appear at public events. He has never done a commentary track. He has been described by colleagues as genuinely eccentric and as a singular comedic intelligence. His episodes tend toward a particular style of comedy that builds through accumulation of strange details until the episode has constructed an entire bizarre world that operates by its own internal logic. Homer's Enemy, which we discussed earlier, was a Swartzwelder script. So was Cape Fear. So was Homer at the Bat, the baseball episode in which a series of celebrity ringers hired by Burns are systematically felled by increasingly improbable mishaps. The room also included George Meyer, who has been described by many of his colleagues as the person most responsible for the show's distinctive voice. Meyer's specialty was adding a specific kind of darkness to a joke at its last stage, finding the unexpected turn that made something funnier and stranger, and slightly more disturbing than it had been before his involvement. He is not as famous as Groening or the show's executive producers. He is not a household name, but in the community of people who care deeply about The Simpsons, he is understood as a foundational presence. Al Jean has been the show's showrunner for most of its recent history, since season 13. His tenure is the longest single continuous creative leadership in the show's run, and it has been the target of both criticism, for what critics see as the show's diminished ambition in recent seasons, and defense, for what its defenders see as a remarkable sustained achievement in keeping an institution alive and functional across 2 decades. The writer's room is also, when you look at it honestly, a picture of a specific kind of success story in American creative culture. It's a room where intelligence was rewarded, where obscure knowledge was useful, where being weird in the right ways translated directly into professional achievement. The show produced by this room reflects that. It rewards attention. It rewards the kind of viewer who notices the joke in the background, while also following the joke in the foreground. It trusts its audience to be smarter than television usually assumes its audience to be. That trust was itself a creative position. It was a bet that a significant portion of the television-watching public would prefer to be slightly challenged by their entertainment rather than simply served their expectations. The early seasons proved the bet correct. The show was genuinely popular and genuinely sophisticated at the same time. That combination is rarer than it should be in television history. Section 6. The Dark Underbelly. Real Tragedy in a Cartoon World. Phil Hartman and the Loss of Troy McClure. Phil Hartman was a comedian's comedian. He was one of the most technically gifted performers of his generation, with a capacity for inhabiting completely different comedic registers. The pompous, the oblivious, the warmly fraudulent, that made him invaluable in any ensemble he joined. On Saturday Night Live, where he spent 8 seasons, he was often described as the glue, the person who could play against any cast member's energy and make it work. When he joined The Simpsons as a recurring voice actor, he brought that quality with him. In Springfield, Hartman voiced 2 characters who are, in retrospect, among the most perfectly constructed comic creations in the show's history. The first was Lionel Hutz, a genuinely incompetent attorney who combined boundless professional optimism with catastrophic legal ability. Hutz specialized in personal injury lawsuits and had a philosophical relationship with truth that the show mined for years. He was the kind of lawyer who would, in an emergency, replace his business card with a card that said, "Another dead soldier," referring to a glass of water he'd consumed. He was absurd in the most specific and recognizable way. Anyone who has ever encountered a particular kind of overconfident mediocrity would recognize Lionel Hutz immediately. The second character was Troy McClure, a washed-up B-list actor who introduced himself, always, with a full accounting of his previous projects. "You may remember me from such films as Get Confident, Stupid, and Alice Doesn't Live Anymore." Troy had once been a somebody. He existed in that particular mid-range Hollywood purgatory where enough name recognition remained to get work, but not enough to get the kind of work that would confirm the name recognition was still meaningful. Troy was shameless in his self-promotion and absolutely transparent in his shallowness, and the audience loved him for both of these qualities. He was the perfect small-screen presence, a man built for exactly the kind of medium that would have him. Hartman was murdered by his wife in May 1998. She then took her own life. Their children were in the house. The Simpsons' response was to retire both characters permanently. No replacement voice actors were hired. Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure made their final appearances, and the show allowed them to fade out quietly, without announcement, simply by never mentioning them again. This was the right decision. It was also an extraordinarily difficult one, because both characters were deeply embedded in the show's fabric. Hutz had been used in multiple major storylines. McClure had hosted several important clip shows and specials that served structural purposes within the show's history. Their permanent absence created gaps in the show's universe that have never been filled. Stories the writers might have told through those characters had to be told differently or not at all. The decision to retire the characters also says something about the show's relationship with the people who gave those characters life. The Simpsons is, in many ways, a machine. It has thousands of episodes. It has outlasted almost everyone who contributed to its early seasons. It has survived every kind of creative and professional disruption imaginable. But it chose, in the case of Phil Hartman, to leave a gap rather than fill it. That choice was a form of mourning made permanent. Every episode since 1998, in which someone could have hired a fraudulent lawyer but didn't. Every episode in which a B-list actor could have appeared to introduce something but didn't. Those absences are the show keeping a space open. Not explaining, not replacing, just keeping the space. The religious dimension. The Simpsons is, by the standards of American primetime network television, a remarkably engaged television show when it comes to religion. It takes faith seriously as a subject. It does not reduce it to mockery or to simple piety. It holds the tensions of religious belief, the genuine comfort it offers, the genuine difficulty it requires, with a complexity that the rest of American television has rarely matched. Ned Flanders is the show's primary religious character, and the show's treatment of him is neither the satire of religiosity that one might expect, nor the simple celebration of faith. Ned believes, genuinely and deeply. His faith is the organizing principle of his life. It gives him a framework for absorbing suffering. It gives him a language for community. It gives him access to a form of peace that the rest of Springfield, swimming in its various anxieties, cannot always reach. But the show also shows you what Ned's faith costs him. It shows you the therapeutic origin of his goodness. It shows you the rage that his conditioning suppresses. It shows you a man for whom faith has become not simply a relationship with God, but a management strategy for a deeply wounded psychology. The show does not tell you that his faith is therefore false, or his goodness therefore fraudulent. It tells you that both things are true simultaneously. His faith is genuine, and it is also a coping mechanism. His goodness is real, and it is also performed under considerable internal pressure. Both can be true. In this, the show offers a more sophisticated portrait of what religious practice actually looks like in a real person's life than almost any other drama or comedy on American television. Homer's relationship with God is different, and also remarkable. God appears to Homer multiple times over the course of the series, most importantly in the Season 4 premiere Homer the Heretic, in which Homer decides to stop going to church and spends a perfect Sunday at home, while the rest of the family is at services. The episode ends with Homer's house catching fire, which seems like divine punishment, until the various Springfield characters who were not at Homer's house because they were at church end up saving him. The show resists making this a simple moral lesson. God speaks to Homer in the episode with genuine warmth. He tells Homer that the relationship between God and people is more complicated than any single institution can fully contain. It's one of the gentlest and most honestly theological things a primetime comedy has ever put in a character's mouth. The show has also, over its run, engaged seriously with Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and various forms of new religious movements, usually with a consistency of treatment that reflects the show's general policy of being willing to take shots at anything but being careful to take them thoughtfully. The jokes about organized religion in the Simpsons universe tend to be about the gap between institutional religion and genuine faith, between what a church asks its members to do and what those members actually experience in their hearts. That's a specifically Protestant critique rooted in the American religious tradition, which makes sense given that the show is a portrait of a specific strand of American middle-class culture. But it is applied with enough even-handedness that it rarely feels like simple anti-religious mockery. What the show ultimately says about religion, across 36 seasons of engagement with the subject, is something like this. Faith is real, and it is human, and it is complicated, and it is often the thing that gets people through their worst days, and the institutions built around it are imperfect containers for something that exceeds their capacity. And people navigate this contradiction in every possible way, with grace, and with dysfunction, and with everything in between. That's not a simple view, but it's an honest one. Conan O'Brien's episodes. Before Conan O'Brien became one of American television's most beloved late-night hosts, he was a Simpsons writer. He worked on the show from 1991 to 1993, during what most fans consider the period of peak creative output, and his contribution to the show's DNA during those years is difficult to fully calculate, because the writer's room functioned as a collective in a way that makes individual attribution complicated. What is known is that O'Brien received writing credits on several episodes that are now considered among the show's finest. Marge versus the Monorail, which is unambiguously one of the 10 greatest episodes the show has produced, was written by O'Brien. The episode is a parody of The Music Man, set in Springfield, in which a con man arrives and sells the town on the idea of building a monorail using a windfall of fine money. The episode has a kind of sustained comedic energy that feels genuinely different from some of the show's other great episodes, more densely packed with jokes, more willing to use musical sequences as comedy delivery mechanisms, more overtly theatrical in its construction. There is a song in the episode, performed during the town meeting where the monorail is being pitched, in which the con man seduces the entire town with a choreographed production number that gets steadily more absurd as it continues. Every Springfield character joins in. The number escalates through genre parodies and increasingly improbable rhyme schemes. It is one of the most purely joyful sequences in the show's history, and it ends with the town having been completely taken in, despite the fact that the song contained no actual argument for why a monorail was a good idea, and multiple reasons why it was clearly not. O'Brien has said in interviews that the episode came from a genuine love of musicals and a genuine interest in the mechanics of mass persuasion. The monorail is not just a con. It's a metaphor for how enthusiasm operates. People don't buy the monorail because they've been given good reasons to buy it. They buy it because the pitch was exciting, and the pitch made them feel like part of something larger than themselves. They buy it because wanting things together as a community, feels good, even when the thing you're wanting together is stupid. That's a sophisticated observation dressed up as a musical parody of a Robert Preston vehicle. O'Brien put it in a cartoon in 1993, and people are still singing the song 30 years later. He left the show when NBC offered him the late-night job. The show's quality did not immediately collapse after he left. But his departure was part of a broader transition in the writer's room from its original configuration to a new one, and the transition is visible in the quality of the work over the following seasons. Section 7. The Conspiracy Layer. Theories that hold water. Burns owns everything. We've talked about the Springfield nuclear power plant. We've talked about what it does to the water, to the bodies, to the cognitive function of the people who live downstream from its cracked cooling towers. But there's a layer of Burns's control over Springfield that goes beyond the plant, and it operates through institutions rather than through radiation. Burns does not simply own an energy company. Burns owns Springfield's economy. The power plant is the largest employer in town. That employment relationship gives Burns direct influence over the financial security of a significant percentage of Springfield's households. But the influence extends further than direct employment, because the businesses that serve plant employees, Moe's Tavern, the grocery store, the retail outlets along Springfield's main commercial strip, all depend on those employees having money to spend. Burns's economic power radiates outward from the plant like concentric circles, each ring further from the source but still connected to it. This structure gives Burns the ability to exert political influence in Springfield without ever needing to run for office or engage in conventional lobbying. He doesn't need to buy politicians. He needs to be understood as the entity whose goodwill is prerequisite to economic stability. Politicians in Springfield understand, at a level below conscious articulation, that nothing they do can directly threaten Burns without triggering consequences that will land not on Burns but on their constituents. The plant employs people. The plant provides electricity. The plant is the economic anchor of the town. Threatening the plant means threatening all of that, and no Springfield politician has ever managed to translate that logic into action that seriously challenged Burns's interests. The show demonstrates this repeatedly and somewhat casually. Mayor Quimby is corrupt in the specific way that local politicians tend to be in company towns. Not necessarily in service of the company's interests out of explicit agreement, but in service of his own survival, which requires not making enemies of the people who can make his constituents' lives worse. Quimby may genuinely not like Burns. It doesn't matter. The structural relationship between his political survival and Burns's economic power makes explicit conflict essentially impossible. This is not unique to Springfield. It is the normal situation in towns organized around a single large employer, and it is one of the show's sharpest and most consistent pieces of social commentary. Small American towns with economies dominated by a single industry, a mine, a mill, a military base, a large manufacturing plant, have historically experienced exactly this dynamic. The employer becomes so central to the town's survival that the normal democratic mechanisms by which citizens hold economic power accountable become effectively paralyzed. People who depend on the employer for their income cannot afford to be the public face of a challenge to that employer, even when they know the challenge is correct. Springfield is this dynamic made explicit and slightly absurd, with the added element that the employer in question is also personally responsible for irradiating the population. But the underlying structure is recognizable. Burns is not simply a villain in the story. He is a structural condition that the story is set inside. The town cannot remove him without removing the foundation of its own economy, and so it doesn't try. It complains. It occasionally rises up, and then it settles back down and reports to work on Monday morning. Patty and Selma as the marriage's immune system. There is a theory about Marge's sisters that doesn't quite fit the tone of a conspiracy, but has a logic too consistent to ignore. Patty and Selma Bouvier have been, for 36 seasons, unambiguously hostile to Homer Simpson. They dislike him. They make no effort to hide this dislike. They undermine him at family gatherings. They comment on his weight, and his intelligence, and his career. They do the kind of consistent low-level damage to a man's self-esteem that can, over time, be as corrosive as larger crises. The conventional reading is that they're comic characters who exist to torment Homer. This is partly true, but there's another reading that the show supports quietly across many episodes. Patty and Selma are protective of Marge, not in any articulated or planned way, but the cumulative effect of their hostility toward Homer, is that Marge always has people in her corner who have never been persuaded to like him. Marge's marriage has been tested many times. Homer has betrayed her trust. He has been irresponsible and selfish and catastrophically bad at prioritizing her needs. And every time the marriage has been in crisis, Marge has had two people in her life who would not try to talk her into forgiving him for his own sake. This creates a structural check on Homer's behavior that nothing else in Springfield provides. Burns doesn't care about Homer's marriage. Bart and Lisa need their parents together. Lenny and Carl are Homer's friends and will side with him. But Patty and Selma will always, no matter what Homer has done this episode, be available to Marge as the people who never bought the act. That availability is, paradoxically, one of the things that makes the marriage survivable. It gives Marge an exit even when she chooses not to take it, and the knowledge that the exit exists, that she is not trapped, that people who love her specifically, rather than the family unit, exist in her life, might be part of what allows her to keep choosing to stay. The show never makes this explicit. Patty and Selma are not generous characters who are secretly serving Marge's well-being through their hostility. They simply don't like Homer and they aren't going to pretend otherwise. But the effect of their consistency is a kind of insurance. In a marriage with as much turbulence as Marge and Homer's, having two people who will never be persuaded to minimize your experience is not a small thing. Patty and Selma are not warm characters. The show does not reward them with happiness in proportion to their faithfulness to Marge. But they are, in their way, the most reliable presences in Marge's life outside of her children. They will be there. They will be negative about Homer. And Marge can always choose how to use that. Flanders as the repressed self. We talked about Ned Flanders in the context of the damage done to him by his parents' therapeutic experiment. But there is another layer to the relationship between Homer and Ned that operates differently, and it's worth examining on its own terms. Homer and Ned have lived next door to each other for 36 years. They are, by any reasonable analysis, extremely different people with extremely different values and extremely different relationships to almost every aspect of life. Homer is impulsive, gluttonous, faithless about most things, physically large and often loud. Ned is disciplined, moderate, deeply religious, physically fit, measured. But here is what's interesting. Homer and Ned are the same age. They grew up in the same town. They presumably attended the same schools, experienced the same cultural moments, breathed the same air, and they arrived at adulthood in completely opposite configurations. The theory is that they represent two possible resolutions of the same fundamental anxiety. The anxiety is, am I good enough? Do I deserve the things I have? Will I be loved if people see me clearly? Homer's resolution is to abandon the question. Homer does not ask whether he deserves things. He simply wants them and often gets them. And when he doesn't, he suffers briefly and recovers completely. He has no capacity for the kind of sustained self-judgment that would make this anxiety chronic. This is a deficit in Homer, intellectually and emotionally. But it is also, accidentally, a survival strategy. You cannot be devastated by falling short of a standard you've never fully accepted. Ned's resolution is to exceed the standard in every possible direction. He is good in all the ways that can be measured. He is generous. He is patient. He is faithful. He is kind. His resolution is to make the question unanswerable by performing an answer so comprehensive that no one could doubt it. This is psychologically painful but socially impressive. Ned is, by external measure, the better man. Homer, from the outside, cannot understand Ned's exhausting commitment to goodness. Ned, from the outside, cannot fully respect Homer's effortless comfort in his own imperfection. Each represents to the other a life that their own psychology makes impossible. And here is the part that makes this theory hold. Homer genuinely likes Ned. He is annoyed by Ned constantly. He borrows his things and doesn't return them. He is careless with Ned's feelings and property and time. But the fondness is real. And Ned, despite everything, despite the years of treatment, despite the fact that Homer's carelessness killed his wife, is genuinely attached to Homer. Not just because his conditioning compels him toward forgiveness, because Homer is the one person in Springfield who is not performing his version of himself. Homer is simply being Homer, entirely and without apology. And that rawness is the opposite of everything Ned has had to do to survive. And he is, somewhere beneath the conditioning and the faith and the repressed rage, drawn to it. They cannot be the same person. but they might be the two halves of one person who got separated early and built their lives around the absence of the other half. Section 8. Production Secrets. What happened behind the scenes? Animation errors and what they reveal. The Simpsons has produced over 750 episodes across 36 seasons. The animation pipeline for each episode passes through multiple studios, multiple teams of artists, multiple stages of revision. Errors are, under these conditions, both inevitable and informative. The mistakes that make it to air, and over 750 episodes there are many, reveal things about the production process that intentional content cannot. There are continuity errors that simply reflect the difficulty of maintaining visual consistency across a show this large. Characters appear with the wrong eye color in a scene. Objects disappear between cuts. A car is blue in one shot and red in the next. These are the ordinary friction of large-scale animation production, and they carry no particular meaning. But there are other errors that are more interesting. Errors that appear to reflect genuine internal disagreements about what a character is, or what a scene means, or what visual language the show is supposed to be using. In the early seasons, The Simpsons' skin color was inconsistent in ways that suggest the production was still deciding what yellow was supposed to look like against different backgrounds. The yellow would go more golden in certain lighting. The rendering of faces in crowds was variable. This inconsistency is visible if you watch the early episodes back to back, and it creates the impression of a show feeling its way toward a visual identity rather than executing an established one. Later seasons have more consistent animation quality due to improved production processes, but they introduce a different kind of visual problem, a uniformity that makes individual scenes feel interchangeable in ways the early seasons did not. The rough edges of the early animation, which felt like evidence of human hands doing something slightly different each time, are absent. The show looks more polished and less alive. There are also errors that appear to be deliberate jokes. The chalkboard gag, which changes every week, has occasionally contained intentional misspellings and errors as part of its comedy. Several couch gags have ended in ways that visually contradict the show's established reality. These deliberate unreliabilities are part of the show's visual grammar. They tell you not to trust everything you see, which is both a comedy technique and, under some of the theories we've discussed, something more philosophically loaded. The most famous animation-adjacent curiosity in the show's history is arguably the question of Maggie's price scanner moment in the opening credits. When Marge checks out at the grocery store, Maggie is passed over the scanner. The scanner reads a price. In the early seasons, the price was a joke, a recognizable number related to the cost of raising a child for 1 year in the United States. In later seasons, the price changed, and the joke became something else. In some versions, the scanner can't read Maggie. In some, the price is 0. The change is never announced. It is just different. And the difference, if you're looking for it, might mean something, or might mean nothing at all. Censored and altered episodes. The Simpsons has been broadcast around the world in dozens of countries, and has in many of those countries been subject to editing that the American audience never saw. Some of these edits are straightforward responses to local broadcast standards. Scenes involving alcohol are shortened for broadcast in countries with stricter regulations. References to specific political figures are altered for markets where those figures carry different weight. But some of the alterations are more interesting. The episode Stark Raving Dad, which featured Michael Jackson's voice, was pulled from broadcast by Fox at Michael Jackson's request in 2019, following the release of the documentary Leaving Neverland. The episode had aired for 28 years, had been included in DVD releases, had been referenced in countless retrospective lists of the show's greatest episodes. Its removal from streaming platforms and future broadcasts was sudden and complete. The episode does not currently exist on Disney Plus or any other legal streaming service. It can only be found in physical media collections. The show's response to this, as an institution, was compliance. There was no public debate within the production about whether the episode's merit justified keeping it available despite the context of the Jackson accusations. It was removed. This is worth noting because The Simpsons has not, in general, been a show that removes its own history. Episodes that contain jokes that have aged poorly have remained in the archive. Episodes that deal with subjects the show would probably not approach the same way now have not been quietly retired. The removal of stark Raving Dad represents an exception that highlights, by contrast, the general rule. There is also the matter of the Apu controversy, which emerged publicly around 2017 when a documentary called The Problem with Apu made the case that the character of Apu Nahasapima Petalan, a convenience store owner, voiced by the white actor Hank Azaria in an Indian accent, was a stereotype that had done real damage to South Asian Americans by reducing their cultural representation to a comedic accent and a set of associated cliches. The show's initial response was awkward. A short segment in an episode acknowledged the controversy in a way that many viewers found dismissive. Azaria eventually gave up the role and issued a public apology. Apu's presence in recent episodes has been minimal, and his character has not been recast. The Apu situation is a genuinely complex one that touches on questions about who comedy is for and what obligations long-running cultural institutions have when they're shown that their choices caused harm. The show's handling of it was imperfect, as the handling of any genuinely complex cultural situation usually is. But the final resolution, Azaria's departure and Apu's diminished presence, represents a change in the show that reflects a change in how the culture is willing to receive certain kinds of comedy. The archive remains intact. The jokes that once landed differently are still there for anyone who looks. But the show is no longer actively reinforcing them. The International Simpsons. The Simpsons exists in versions that the American audience has never seen. In several countries, the show has been dubbed with such thoroughness that local audiences experience it as a native production. The German dub, which has been running for decades, has developed its own vocal performances and comic timing that are understood by German fans as the definitive version of the show. Characters have German names in some markets. Local cultural references replace American ones, where the original joke would have been meaningless. The most extensive cultural adaptation of The Simpsons was the Middle East version, Al-Shamshun, which aired in Arabic-speaking markets in 2005. In Al-Shamshun, Homer was renamed Omar, Bart was Badr, and the show was significantly adapted to remove elements that would have been inappropriate for its target audience. Bacon was replaced with beef. Beer was replaced with a soft drink. The family's Christianity was not referenced. The jokes were rebuilt around culturally appropriate premises. Al-Shamshun ran for only a single season before being canceled, partly because audiences found the culturally neutralized version of the show less funny than the American original, which had developed a cult following in the region precisely because of its Americanness. The very things that had been removed to make the show accessible were the things that made it interesting. This outcome is itself an interesting observation about how cultural specificity functions in comedy. The Simpsons is funny, partly because it is specific. It is about a particular kind of American life, with particular textures and references and anxieties. Removing those specifics in the attempt to make it universal produces something less universally appealing, not more. The lesson, which the Al-Shamshun experiment illustrates very cleanly, is that universality in comedy usually arrives through depth of specificity rather than breadth of generality. The more precisely a thing captures a particular human experience, the more people from outside that experience can recognize something in it. Section 9. The really deep stuff: documents, disputes, and departures. The Simpsons Bible. Every television show begins with a document. It might be called a show Bible, a writer's guide, a series overview. It is the foundational text that describes the show's world, its characters, its rules. It tells writers what the show is, so they can make more of it without the original creator in the room for every decision. The Simpsons Bible, written in the show's earliest days, is one of the more interesting creative documents in television history. It describes Homer and Marge and their children with a psychological precision that the show itself sometimes exceeded and sometimes failed to reach. It establishes rules for what the characters will and will not do. It describes their relationships to each other with enough detail to constitute a genuine theory of family dynamics. What's interesting about the document, and about its relationship to the show that grew out of it, is that the show fairly quickly exceeded the Bible's vision. The characters became larger than the descriptions. They accumulated history and contradiction and depth that no founding document could have anticipated. And the Bible became less a set of instructions and more a historical artifact, a record of what the show was supposed to be before it figured out what it actually was. This is a normal development in long-running creative works. The founding vision is always partial. The thing grows past it. But the Simpsons Bible is specific enough in its character descriptions that you can, reading it, identify the precise moments in the show's history where it was being honored and the moments where it was being departed from. Homer's essential decency, his inability to sustain cruelty even when he attempts it, is in the Bible. His love of Marge, which is the bedrock of his character even when the show is doing something else entirely with him, is in the Bible. These qualities were protected in the show's best years and gradually softened in its later ones. The Bible is not publicly available in its entirety. Fragments have been shared and discussed by people connected to the show's early history, but its existence is part of the reason that the show's core relationships have retained their recognizability across 36 years of wildly varying quality. The rules written down in the beginning have been a gravitational force even when the show has floated far from them. Characters drift. The Bible pulls them back. Sometimes. Sam Simon and What Happened. Sam Simon is a name that does not appear in the cultural conversation about The Simpsons as often as it should. He was, along with Matt Groening and James L. Brooks, one of the show's 3 founding executive producers. He was responsible for much of the show's foundational structure, its visual language, its character design, its storytelling approach. He assembled the original writing staff. He established many of the production processes that allowed the show to maintain quality, while meeting the extraordinary demands of weekly animated television. He left the show after season 4, in 1993. He had been at the center of creative disagreements with his co-producers that had made his continued involvement untenable. The departure was not amicable. He retained his title as executive producer and continued to receive substantial financial compensation from the show's success. He also largely disappeared from the show's public narrative. Sam Simon used his Simpsons wealth to fund the Sam Simon Foundation, which focused on animal rescue and feeding people in need. He became one of the more significant private philanthropists working on those specific issues. He funded food banks, he purchased mobile kitchens that distributed meals, he worked on animal welfare causes with a seriousness and a personal involvement that went beyond check writing. In 2012, Simon was diagnosed with terminal colon cancer. He was told he had a few months to live. He proceeded to spend the next 2.5 years, giving away his money as fast as he could before he died. He donated to charities. He made personal commitments to causes he believed in. He essentially organized his remaining life around the question of how to spend his remaining resources in ways that would outlast him. He died in March 2015. The story of Sam Simon is one of The Simpsons' real stories, the human story behind the cartoon, and it is told too rarely. The show was built by 3 people working together in a specific moment of creative alignment. One of them had a difficult departure and lived the rest of his life largely outside of the show's public narrative. And he used the time and the money that the show gave him to do something genuinely remarkable. That's worth knowing. It is part of what the show made possible, not just the television, but the specific human outcomes of the specific people whose combined effort produced it. The voice actor negotiations. The voice actors who give the Simpsons family their voices have, over the course of the show's run, become among the highest-paid performers in television history. This is a fact that has been accompanied by several rounds of negotiation that have at various points threatened the show's continued existence. The most significant of these occurred in 1998 and again in 2011. The 1998 negotiation resulted in the 6 principal voice actors, Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, Hank Azaria, and Harry Shearer, each receiving what was then the highest per-episode fee ever paid to voice actors in American television. The negotiation was conducted collectively and was described at the time as both contentious and ultimately satisfying for all parties. The 2011 negotiation was more publicly fraught. Fox stated publicly that it would consider ending the show rather than meet the voice actors' demands, which were described as requiring a significant increase over what was already a very substantial per-episode fee. The standoff was resolved with a pay increase that was smaller than initially demanded but larger than Fox's initial offer, and the show continued. Harry Shearer has had the most publicly complicated relationship with the show's production. He has voiced multiple characters including Mr. Burns, Smithers, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, Kent Brockman, and others. In 2015, he announced that he was leaving the show due to what he described as a restriction on his ability to pursue other projects. The announcement was significant because Shearer voices so many of the show's most essential supporting characters that his departure would have required either recasting or retiring those characters. The situation was ultimately resolved, with Shearer returning to the show after a few weeks of uncertainty. The voice actor negotiations are, at their core, a specific version of a recurring conversation in American entertainment about the relationship between creative performance and production power. The voice actors did not create The Simpsons, but they are inseparable from it. Dan Castellaneta is Homer Simpson in a way that goes beyond casting. If you imagine Homer's voice played by someone else, the character stops being the character you know. The voices are the characters in a way that is probably unique in American animation. And this inseparability gives the performers a form of leverage that is genuine, but also uncomfortable for the corporate structure that owns the property. The show needs them. They need the show. The negotiations are the mechanism by which this mutual dependence works itself out in practical terms. Episode by episode, season by season, for 36 years. The Matt Groening departure from creative control. At some point in the show's history, Matt Groening became less of a day-to-day creative presence and more of an institutional figure. This transition happened gradually, rather than in a single moment, but its effects on the show are real and have been discussed by people who worked on it. Groening's primary contribution in the early seasons was providing the foundational vision and the character designs and, crucially, functioning as a creative check on material that departed too far from what the show was supposed to be. He had a specific sense of what The Simpsons were. He knew who Homer was. He knew what the show was doing emotionally. And his presence in the production process meant that individual episodes had to pass through that sense, that personal knowledge of the characters, before they aired. As the show continued and Groening became involved in other projects, including Futurama and later Disenchantment, his involvement in individual episodes became necessarily less intensive. The show's creative direction passed more completely to the showrunners and writers. Al Jean, who has been showrunner for most of the show's post-season 12 run, has a deep knowledge of the show and a genuine investment in it. But the knowledge of an experienced collaborator is different from the knowledge of the person who drew Homer in a notebook in a waiting room and decided to name him after his father. The question of how much of The Simpsons that airs now reflects Groening's vision is not entirely answerable. What is true is that the show has continued for much longer than its creator could have anticipated, staffed by generations of writers who grew up watching it rather than making it, and that this lineage creates a different relationship to the material than the original team had. Later writers loved The Simpsons as fans love things. The original team loved it as people who were still figuring out what it was. Section 10. The Bottom of the Iceberg. What the show really is and what it really did. What Springfield did to America. Here is a claim worth sitting with slowly. The Simpsons may be the most culturally influential piece of American media of the 20th century. Not the most beloved, not the most watched in absolute numbers, but the most influential, in the sense that it altered the way a generation of Americans understood themselves and their world, and what comedy was allowed to do. Before The Simpsons, American primetime animated television was, almost without exception, designed for children, or for the least demanding possible adult audience. Animation was a medium for simplicity. The Simpsons changed this so completely that its influence is almost invisible now, because everything that came after it, every animated adult comedy that has appeared in the 36 years since its premiere, exists in a landscape that The Simpsons created. But the influence went further than animation. The show demonstrated, more successfully than any previous American television program, that satire of American culture and institutions could be commercially viable at the highest levels of primetime network television. The Simpsons made money for Fox, enormous amounts of money, and it made that money by depicting an American corporation, Burns's plant, as a criminal enterprise that poisoned children, by depicting American government, in the form of Mayor Quimby's administration, as casually corrupt, by depicting American education as underfunded and poorly administered, and by depicting the American dream as something that was available to Homer Simpson at the cost of making him impervious to ambition. This was not gentle or subtle satire. It was pointed and specific, and it ran every Sunday night for years before most Americans fully processed what they were absorbing. And what they were absorbing was a frame for understanding their own society. The Springfield nuclear power plant became a way of thinking about real nuclear power plants. Mr. Burns became a shorthand for a certain kind of wealthy industrialist. Homer's inability to be promoted despite his incompetence became a way of understanding how institutional loyalty can be weaponized against workers. The show did not radicalize its audience. That would be too simple and too strong a claim. But it furnished its audience with a specific set of images and stories and jokes that operated as a reference library for thinking about power and class, and the ways institutions fail people. When a real news story involved a wealthy industrialist evading environmental regulations, viewers had a template. When a story involved a city government making terrible decisions for its own convenience, viewers had a template. Springfield was the template. This is what the predictions discussion, which we talked about earlier, actually describes when you look at it directly. The show didn't predict the future. It gave its audience a way of recognizing the future when it arrived. Because the future, in certain of its aspects, had already been depicted in Springfield, already been named and structured and made familiar. The shock of recognition when a real event matched a Springfield storyline was not the shock of prophecy. It was the shock of seeing your own framework confirmed. We knew this was possible because Springfield showed us it was possible. The Simpsons is, in this sense, one of the most politically effective pieces of American popular culture in the 20th century, not because it was propaganda for any particular position, but because it was a detailed and affectionate and honest portrait of how American power actually operates. And it delivered this portrait in a format that 40 million people watched every week while eating dinner on the couch. Groening's Other Worlds. Matt Groening has built two other substantial fictional universes since The Simpsons. Futurama, which premiered in 1999, was an animated science fiction comedy set 1,000 years in the future, following a delivery company staffed by a slovenly human, a narcissistic robot, and an alien doctor with multiple appendages. Disenchantment, which premiered on Netflix in 2018, was a medieval fantasy comedy following a princess who was disappointed in her destiny. Both shows are recognizably Groening productions. They share certain visual qualities with The Simpsons, a family resemblance in character design that is probably inevitable given that the same creator was involved. They share a tendency toward comedy that earns its absurdity through emotional groundedness. They share a willingness to engage with dark material through the filtering mechanism of warmth. Futurama became a beloved property in its own right, surviving a cancellation and revival that gave it an unusual relationship with its own ending. The show was canceled by Fox in 2003, revived in 2008 on Comedy Central after fan campaigns, canceled again in 2013, and revived again on Hulu in 2022. Its relationship with endings has been philosophically interesting. The show has written multiple series finales, each one designed as a genuine conclusion to its story, only to find itself revived and required to continue from where the conclusion left off. This means Futurama has experienced something like what the Simpsons theorists described for Homer: a repeated resurrection, a refusal to let the story end, a world that keeps restarting despite having genuinely concluded. Disenchantment has been less celebrated, but has its own devoted audience. It takes longer to develop its character dynamics and relies more heavily on serialized storytelling than Groening's previous work. It is, in some ways, the most ambitious structural project he has undertaken, attempting to sustain a fantasy world with genuine emotional arcs across multiple seasons, rather than using the episodic reset that The Simpsons made its defining formal choice. What's interesting about Groening's Other Worlds, in the context of a deep examination of The Simpsons, is what they reveal about what he was reaching for that The Simpsons could and couldn't give him. Futurama is, in some ways, The Simpsons freed from its domestic constraints. It can do science fiction. It can engage with questions about consciousness and identity and the nature of humanity in ways that the Springfield frame doesn't easily accommodate. It can kill characters with genuine permanence. It can let its world change in response to events. It can, occasionally, be genuinely devastating in ways that The Simpsons, constrained by its domestic comedy premise and its floating timeline, cannot allow itself to be. This suggests that Groening, even while producing The Simpsons, was aware of what it couldn't do. He was doing it anyway. He was choosing the constraints of Springfield, choosing the eternal present, choosing Homer's impervious happiness, and Marge's patient love, and Bart's frozen youth. He was choosing all of that because it served something he understood about what the show was for. But he was also, simultaneously, building worlds that could do the things Springfield couldn't. That dual awareness, building the show that works within its limits while also building the show that works beyond them, is part of what makes Groening's body of work coherent as a whole rather than as three separate properties. He is always asking the same questions. What does it mean to belong somewhere? What does family cost you, and what does it give back? What does it feel like to be alive in a particular moment of American history with a particular set of people you didn't choose and couldn't replace? Springfield is one answer to those questions. New York in the year 3000 is another answer. The medieval kingdom of Dreamland is a third. They are different answers given to the same question from different angles, like looking at the same person from across a room, from close up and from behind. Three perspectives on one life. What the finale might look like. The Simpsons will end. All things end. The question that fans and critics and industry observers have been circling for many years now is what the ending of The Simpsons would look like, what form it would take, what it would need to do to properly close a story that has been running for 36 years. This is not a simple question. The show has structured itself around the impossibility of ending. The floating timeline, the reset button, the eternal present. All of these formal choices exist precisely to prevent the story from having a conclusion. Bart will not grow up. Lisa will not leave Springfield. Marge and Homer will not grow old. The show cannot give itself an ending without undoing the premise that has sustained it for 3.5 decades. Groening has spoken occasionally about a finale. He has said that he imagines it would need to acknowledge the show's history in some way, that it could not simply be another episode. He has suggested that the Simpsons family would need to face the floating timeline directly, to reckon with the fact of their own frozen existence, for the story to end with any honesty. What this might look like practically is genuinely interesting to imagine. The most honest ending to the show, given everything we've discussed in this exploration, would be an ending that allows its characters to age, an ending in which Bart becomes 11, and then 12, and then grows up. An ending in which Lisa leaves for college, and Homer and Marge sit in the empty house on Evergreen Terrace and feel what that means. An ending in which the town of Springfield allows itself to change. That ending would require the show to contradict its own structural premise, so completely that it would amount to a formal declaration. The premise was a lie, and here is what the truth looks like. It would be devastating. It would be beautiful. It would almost certainly make people cry in a way that few television finales have managed. The alternative is an ending that honors the premise. An ending in which the show acknowledges the loop and chooses to remain in it. An ending in which Homer comes home from work, sits on the couch, looks at his family, and the camera holds on his face for a moment before the credits roll for the last time. An ending that says, this is what it is. It is imperfect, and it is impermanent, and it is enough. We built a loop and we chose to stay in it. And that choice was an act of love, and it does not need to be defended or resolved. Both endings are true to something the show has been. Both would work. Both would leave something out. The show has always been two things simultaneously: a satire of American life that sees its contradictions with clear eyes, and a love story about a family that holds itself together through the sheer force of wanting to stay together. The ending would need to be both of those things at once, which is probably why it keeps not happening. Some things are held together by not ending. And The Simpsons, perhaps more than any other cultural object in American history, understands that particular truth from the inside. The real question. After everything, the real question is not about the show's quality, or its longevity, or its cultural influence. Those are answerable questions, at least in part. The real question is something simpler and harder. Why does it matter? Not why does it matter to the culture, in the sociological sense. Not why does it matter to Fox's revenue stream, or to the history of animated television, or to the careers of the people who made it. Why does it matter to the specific person who has been watching it for whatever portion of their life they've been watching it? Why does someone who grew up in the 90s feel something specific when they hear the theme song? Why does someone who came to the show later, in syndication or in streaming, feel something when they settle in for an episode of a cartoon they've seen 15 times? What is that feeling, and why is it produced by this particular show? The most honest answer might be that The Simpsons was, for a very long time, the most detailed and most affectionate portrait of a certain kind of ordinary American life that popular culture had ever produced. Not the idealized version, not the aspirational version. The version with 4 fingers and yellow skin and cracked cooling towers, and a safety inspector who eats donuts during meltdown warnings. The version where the father is imperfect and the mother is patient and the children are brilliant and difficult and the neighbors are complicated and the town is compromised and the whole fragile thing holds together not because it should by any rational calculation, but because it chooses to. That version of life, that portrait of people loving each other imperfectly in an imperfect place, was given to an enormous audience over 36 years. And the audience absorbed it so completely that it became part of their internal furniture. The Simpsons is not a show most people watch now in the way they watch something new. It is a show most people return to. They come back to it the way you come back to a place you know. The pleasure is in the familiarity. The pleasure is in the recognition. The pleasure is in the certainty that when you get there, things will be where you left them. Bart will be 10. Lisa will be 8. Homer will fall down some stairs. Marge will be patient. The couch will catch them at the end of the opening sequence. And the theme song will conclude on exactly the note it always concludes on. And you will feel, for a moment, that things are the way they were. That the couch you sat on when you first watched this is still somewhere and still yours. That the person you were when you first met these characters is still in there somewhere, waiting to laugh at a joke they've been telling since 1989. That feeling is why the show matters. Not its cultural influence or its comedic innovations or its improbable longevity. The feeling. The Simpsons is the feeling of going home to a place that never changes and staying there for exactly as long as you need. A final note. We went deep tonight. All the way down from the surface, where the couch gags and the guest stars and the donuts live, to the very bottom, where the show's bones are. The real tragedy of Phil Hartman's absence. The real courage of Mona Simpson's activism. The real sadness underneath Ned Flanders' relentless goodness. The real love inside Homer's coma dream. The iceberg is larger than any 2 hours can contain. Springfield keeps giving. Every season, every episode, every background detail, and throwaway joke and carefully planted long-game callback adds another layer to a thing that already has more layers than anyone has fully counted. But you've made it here, to the bottom of this particular descent, and if you're still awake, genuinely well done. Most people drift off somewhere around the section on Sam Simon, which is as good a place as any to fall asleep, surrounded by the quiet knowledge that someone spent his last years giving away everything he'd earned. If you found something in here worth remembering, or worth telling someone about, or worth watching the show again with new eyes, then this was worth the time. Springfield will be there when you go back to it. It always is. The lights are on. The nuclear plant is running. The fish have 3 eyes. Bart is on his skateboard. Maggie is watching everything with those enormous eyes and saying absolutely nothing. Come back whenever you need to. The door is always open on Evergreen Terrace. End of script. Production notes for 11 Labs. Pacing. Slow and even throughout. Slightly slower in emotional passages. Tone. Warm, unhurried, like a late-night radio host who has nowhere to be. Emphasis. Gentle, never sharp or staccato. Pauses. After each section heading, and before sentences that contain the word that, in a structurally significant position. Breath. Natural, do not suppress breathing sounds. They add to the relaxing quality. Volume. Consistent, no dramatic spikes. Section 11. The emotional architecture. How the show makes you feel things you didn't expect to feel. The show's relationship with sadness. The Simpsons is classified as a comedy. Every database, every network presentation, every critical framework applied to it has used that word. Comedy. And it is a comedy. The jokes are real. The timing is real. The laugh track, which the show uses sparingly and strategically, mostly absent in favor of a live audience reaction format that evolved over early seasons, responds to things that are genuinely funny. There is no argument to be made that The Simpsons is secretly a drama. But there are episodes of The Simpsons that produce a specific emotional response that the word comedy does not fully cover. Not just laughter. Something else alongside the laughter, or sometimes instead of it. Something that functions more like the feeling you get when you look at an old photograph of yourself and experience simultaneously the humor of your younger self's confidence and the specific grief of knowing that version of you is gone. The show discovered this territory early and returned to it deliberately. The Season 2 episode One Fish, Two Fish, Blowfish, Bluefish opens as an adventure in a Japanese restaurant and ends with Homer believing he has eaten a lethally prepared fugu fish and has 24 hours to live. The episode follows him through those hours as he tries to do everything a father should do with his family before dying. He reads to Bart. He has a conversation with his own father. He watches Lisa sleep. He holds Maggie. He dances with Marge. The episode is funny. There are good jokes in it. But it is built around a real emotional premise. What would you do with one day? And the answer it gives is not heroic or epic. Homer doesn't complete a bucket list. He doesn't achieve anything extraordinary. He does the small domestic things that he normally rushes past or ignores or takes for granted. He pays attention. He is present. And then he falls asleep waiting for Marge, and wakes up the next morning, not dead after all, and the whole episode dissolves back into ordinary life. The final image is Homer sitting in front of the television, alive, already absorbed in whatever is on screen, already back in the comfortable trance of his normal existence. The lesson, if there is one, lasted roughly until he fell asleep. He will not remember tomorrow what he understood today, but he understood it today. That has to count for something. This emotional architecture, in which the show allows its characters genuine access to feeling, and then lets those feelings pass without resolution, is one of the things that distinguishes The Simpsons from almost every other comedy in television history. Most comedies protect their characters from consequence. The Simpsons lets the consequence land and then chooses not to dramatize the aftermath. It trusts the viewer to carry that consequence forward, even when the show itself is already moving on to the next story. This creates a relationship between the show and its audience that is unusual. The audience knows things about the characters that the characters have forgotten. The audience carries the accumulated weight of what has happened in Springfield, even as Springfield resets each week. In a small but real sense, the audience is the memory of the show. They are the continuity that the show itself refuses to maintain. That's a strange thing to ask of a comedy audience. Most comedies ask you to laugh and return next week. The Simpsons asks you to laugh and remember. The music of Alf Clausen. For 27 seasons, from the show's very first episode through season 27 in 2017, The Simpsons was scored by a composer named Alf Clausen. His contribution to the show's emotional texture is probably the least discussed element of its success, and may be one of the most important. Clausen came from a background in orchestral music and brought a genuine compositional sophistication to what might have been treated as simply functional background music. The Simpsons, particularly in its early seasons, had a distinctive musical personality that went well beyond the requirements of comedy scoring. Episodes were underscored with orchestral passages that could shift from comedic to genuinely moving within a single scene. Musical parodies were elaborate and technically impressive. Musical set pieces, the kind that would accompany Sideshow Bob's operetta or a musical number at Springfield Elementary, were constructed with a craft that treated the show's occasional detours into musical territory as serious artistic endeavors, rather than jokes that happened to have notes. The theme song, composed by Danny Elfman in the show's very first season, established immediately that this was a show that took its own sonic identity seriously. Elfman's theme is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in American popular culture. It has been performed by orchestras worldwide. It has been adapted and sampled and referenced in contexts far removed from the show it was written for. But what makes it remarkable for our purposes is what it does emotionally. The theme is simultaneously chaotic and warm. It has the bouncing energy of a cartoon and the genuine orchestral color of something more ambitious. It prepares you, every time you hear it, to receive something that will be funny and that might also, at some point, make you feel something unexpected. Clausen's work for 27 seasons developed this foundational quality into an enormous body of music that shaped the show's emotional registers with extraordinary consistency. His departure in 2017, when he was replaced by a new team using different production methods, was felt by longtime viewers in a way that most could not quite articulate. The show sounded different, not worse necessarily, but different. A warmth that had been present in the texture of the scoring was absent or changed. The music had always been, underneath everything else, one of the things that told you Springfield was a place worth caring about. Clausen has spoken about his time on the show with characteristic grace. He understood his role as supportive of the story being told, rather than as an opportunity for personal expression. His music served the show rather than advertising its own sophistication. But over 27 seasons, the cumulative effect of that service was a sonic world so integrated with the visual world of Springfield that separating them in memory is genuinely difficult. Lisa and the weight of being right. There is a specific tragedy attached to Lisa Simpson that is very different from Homer's tragedy, or Ned's tragedy, or even Marge's. It is the tragedy of being correct, and being surrounded by people who don't benefit from your correctness and can't afford to acknowledge it. Lisa is right about almost everything. Environmentally, scientifically, ethically, politically. She tends to be on the side of truth, and she tends to know she's on the side of truth, which doesn't make her especially pleasant to be around, but does make her consistently right. She sees the radiation from the plant. She understands what it means. She knows the fish have 3 eyes because the water is contaminated. She can explain every mechanism by which Springfield is being harmed by its own infrastructure. She has the vocabulary and the framework and the intelligence to articulate exactly what is wrong. And nothing changes. She articulates it, she demonstrates it, she occasionally gets a small victory, a successful protest, a moment of institutional acknowledgement, and then the reset arrives, and everything goes back to the way it was. The problem with being right in Springfield is that Springfield's operating logic is specifically designed to make rightness irrelevant. The town is maintained through collective agreement to believe certain things regardless of their truth. Lisa's constant injection of truth into this agreement is a form of disruption that the town absorbs like a body absorbs a splinter. The tissue forms around it. Everything continues. Lisa's relationship with this futility is one of the show's long-running emotional undertones. She has not given up. She is 8 years old and will remain 8 years old, and she has not given up, and she never will. But she has, in the accumulated knowledge of every episode where she's been right and been ignored, developed a specific quality that the show depicts with accuracy. The particular exhaustion of someone who understands a problem that no one around them is willing to solve. It's not despair. Despair would require her to stop caring. It's something more sustained and more difficult than despair. It's care that has learned to exist without hope of immediate reward. The show has given Lisa moments of genuine recognition. There are people in Springfield who see her clearly. Her relationship with Bleeding Gums Murphy, a jazz musician who understood her in the way that certain teachers and artists can understand a child who is too complicated for their immediate environment, is one of the show's most tender things. When Murphy dies, in a season 6 episode that handles grief with unusual directness, Lisa's loss is the loss of one of the few people who knew how to talk to her. The episode does not pretend this isn't serious. It allows her to be devastated. But Murphy is gone, and Lisa's father is impervious to the ideas she needs him to understand. And her brother is a decade away from being emotionally ready to receive what she has to offer. And her mother loves her completely but cannot always follow her. And Springfield will continue to produce the same 3-eyed fish, and the same safety violations, and the same collective forgetting. Lisa endures. That is her story. She endures, and she keeps playing her saxophone, which the show has consistently used as her private language. When everything else fails, the saxophone is still there. The music is still there. And you cannot contaminate music the way you can contaminate water. It does not have 3 eyes. It cannot be owned by Burns or forgotten by the town, or mishandled by a safety inspector with a crayon in his brain. It is hers completely. In a show about things being taken from people, that small, irreducible possession might be the most important thing the show has given any character. Marge's patience and what it actually costs. Marge Simpson is the load-bearing wall of a family that should, by any structural analysis, have collapsed decades ago. She absorbs. She mediates. She forgives. She returns to the table after conversations that would end most marriages. She maintains the household, manages the emotional weather of 5 complicated people, keeps the lights on, keeps the food on the table, keeps the children pointed roughly in the right direction, and does all of this with a consistency so reliable that the show sometimes treats it as background rather than as the central and remarkable act it actually is. The show is aware of the cost. It has returned to Marge's interior life with genuine interest across many episodes. Marge has had moments of genuine crisis, of near departure, of genuine consideration of whether this life is what she wants. In Fear of Flying, she confronts a phobia whose roots lead back to complicated family history. In Scenes from the Class Struggle in Springfield, she navigates the anxiety of class aspiration and what she would have to give up about herself to access the version of life she sometimes thinks she wants. In A Streetcar Named Marge, she is cast in a musical adaptation of A Streetcar Named Desire and discovers in the role of Blanche Dubois a way of expressing things about her own life that ordinary conversation doesn't allow. These episodes are important not simply because they develop Marge as a character, but because they perform a specific function in the show's emotional logic. They demonstrate that Marge's patience is chosen. She is not patient because she lacks the capacity for anything else. She is patient because she has seen the alternatives and continued to choose this family, this house, this life. Her patience is an act of will, and acts of will are entirely different from passive endurance. This distinction is one the show sometimes handles imperfectly in later seasons, where Marge's interior complexity occasionally flattens into simple long-suffering. But the best episodes about her make the choice visible. You see Marge deciding. You see the moment of genuine consideration. And then you see her choose the couch on Evergreen Terrace, and the man she married, and the children who need her. The choice is always visible if you know to look for it. One of the things the coma theory does, which we explored earlier, is reveal something true about what Marge represents in Homer's psychology. If everything is his dream, Marge is not a character in a story. She is his deepest need given form. She is the specific quality of being loved unconditionally by someone who sees you clearly, which is the thing Homer has wanted since his mother disappeared. In the dream, Marge stays. She always stays. She forgives. She returns. She is patient. Of course she is patient. She was designed by the dream to be exactly as patient as Homer needed her to be. That reading, if you hold it lightly without fully committing to the coma theory, reveals something real about the character, regardless of the theory's literal truth. Marge is, in some deep structural sense, the embodiment of what Homer most needs to believe is possible, that someone can know you fully and choose to stay. Her patience isn't a character flaw or a simple virtue. It's the show's central emotional argument, rendered as a woman with a beehive hairdo who is still, after 36 years, standing in the kitchen of a house on Evergreen Terrace, choosing all of this, every single day. Section 12. The Mythology Layer. Recurring Symbols and What They Mean. The nuclear plant as character. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not simply a location. It is the show's engine, in a more fundamental sense than providing Homer's employment, or serving as a site for Mr. Burns's scheming. The plant is the central image of the show's relationship to American industrial life, and everything that radiates from it, economically, physically, politically, cognitively, as we discussed in the radiation theory, is part of what the show has been saying about that relationship for 3.5 decades. American nuclear power has a specific cultural history that informs everything the show does with the plant. Nuclear power was, in the decades after World War II, simultaneously the promise of infinite clean energy and the embodiment of existential dread. The bomb and the reactor came from the same source material and the same science, and the culture was never quite able to separate them in its imagination. The plant that powered your town and the bomb that could end the world were cousins in a way that people felt even when they couldn't articulate it. The Simpsons takes this ambivalence and gives it physical form. Burns's plant powers Springfield and poisons Springfield simultaneously. It is the source of economic stability and physical degradation. It employs Homer and diminishes him. It is indispensable and catastrophic. This duality is not a contradiction in the show's logic. It is the point. The show is describing the actual situation of American industrial life, in which the things that support communities are often also the things that harm them, and the communities are too dependent on the support to risk challenging the harm. 3 Mile Island happened in 1979. Chernobyl happened in 1986. The Simpsons premiered in 1989. These dates are close enough to matter. The show emerged from a specific moment in American nuclear anxiety, when the abstract fear of what a reactor could do had been given concrete form by 2 actual disasters. Burns's plant with its 342 violations, and its cracked cooling towers, and its luminous rats, was not science fiction in 1989. It was satire of something that Americans had just been forced to think very hard about. Over the decades, the plant has also become a meditation on what it means to work in a place that is actively harmful. Homer shows up every day to a facility that he intellectually understands is dangerous, and that he emotionally cannot fully reckon with, because the alternative to showing up is the loss of everything the job provides. This is not a fantasy situation. It is the situation of enormous numbers of people in American history, who worked in mines, in factories, in chemical plants, in circumstances where the work was damaging and the need to work was real. The show asks no one to judge Homer for this. It understands why he goes back. It simply documents, across hundreds of episodes, what that going back costs him over time. The recycling of disaster. There is a pattern in The Simpsons that becomes more visible the more episodes you've watched, and it goes like this. Springfield experiences a catastrophe. The catastrophe is significant enough that it would, in any realistic scenario, permanently alter the town's character. And then, by the next episode, the catastrophe is gone. The town is intact. Nobody mentions what happened. The reset is complete. This pattern is so consistent across the show's run that it has produced, among its most devoted fans, a kind of dark inventory. How many times has Springfield been destroyed? How many times has the Simpson house been burned down? How many times has an event occurred that would, in a real town, be the defining event of that town's history? The number is enormous. The forgetting is total. We've discussed this in the context of the Skinner identity episode and in the context of the radiation theory. But it's worth examining one more time from a different angle, because the recycling of disaster in Springfield is not only a formal device, it's a spiritual one. There is a theological concept, present in various forms across multiple religious traditions, sometimes called eternal return, sometimes called perpetual renewal. The idea is that time does not move in a straight line toward an endpoint. It moves in circles. Events recur. Seasons recur. The possibility of beginning again is always present. Death is followed by rebirth. The destroyed city is rebuilt. The broken relationship is restored. Springfield is structured around this concept, probably not consciously by its creators, but with a consistency that suggests it is operating in the show's logic at a level below deliberate choice. Springfield is always destroyable and always rebuildable. Homer is always killable and always alive again. The family is always potentially torn apart and always, by the end of the episode, back together on the couch. This is not simply laziness or a failure of narrative ambition. It is a specific choice about what kind of story The Simpsons is telling. The story is not a story of progress, in which events build toward a future that is different from the past. It is a story of persistence, of endurance, of the specific human capacity to absorb catastrophe and find yourself at the end, still standing in the same kitchen, making the same breakfast you were making before everything went wrong. That is not a small thing to depict. Most narrative art is structured around change, around development, around the movement from one state to another. The Simpsons chose to build its narrative around stasis, around the loop, around the miracle of remaining essentially intact in a world that keeps trying to unmake you. And then it snuck the change in through the back door. The characters don't change, but we do, watching them. We grow up. We return to the show at different ages and find different things in it, different resonances, different jokes that land differently, different emotional content that we couldn't access before. The characters stay still. We move around them. And in that movement, in our changing relationship to something that doesn't change, the show produces the experience of time passing without ever depicting it directly. That is, when you look at it carefully, a genuinely extraordinary achievement. The Simpsons found a way to dramatize the passage of time by refusing to depict it. Springfield stays frozen. We keep returning. And the gap between what we see and what we remember seeing is where time actually lives. Springfield's animals. The animals of Springfield are, as a category, among the show's most consistently meaningful background elements. They are not simply pets or comic props. They participate in the show's thematic life in ways that reward attention. Santa's little helper, the greyhound the family adopted in the very first episode, is probably the most fully developed animal in American animated television history. He has had his own storylines. He has been lost, separated, temporarily given away, returned. He has shown loyalty, and also the complete absence of loyalty, at various moments. He has been hungry and afraid and joyful and confused in ways that the show renders with genuine specificity, rather than simply using him as a cute background element. Santa's little helper also participates in the radiation theory in the way we discussed earlier. His physical characteristics are consistent with the mutations visible in his human owners. But beyond the theory, he serves a function in the show's emotional economy that is distinct from any character interpretation. He is the family's animal. He lives at a lower level of articulation and consciousness than the humans, but he occupies the same space they do. He sleeps in the same house. He eats from a bowl in the same kitchen. He is subject to the same air, the same water, the same everything. And the show's periodic check-ins on his well-being, the moments when the family's love for him is made visible, function as a kind of emotional thermometer. When the family is caring for Santa's little helper well, things are okay. When he is neglected or endangered, something is wrong that goes beyond the immediate plotline. The cat, Snowball, has existed in multiple iterations. Snowball I was killed in a car accident before the show began. Snowball 2, who appears in the series, is eventually killed and replaced by Snowball 3, then 4, then 5, who happens to resemble the original Snowball so closely that the family simply renames her Snowball 2, and nobody bothers to correct the inconsistency. This sequence of cat deaths and replacements is played as dark comedy, but it also contains, especially read against Springfield's general tendency toward collective forgetting, something genuine. The family cannot hold on to every loss. They give things names, and then the things are gone, and they give the names to new things, and the love, which is real, is redistributed. This is how loss actually works in families over time, and the show found a way to depict it through the deaths and replacements of cats, which is a more honest approach than most dramas achieve with elaborate grief storylines. Blinky the three-eyed fish is the most famous animal in Springfield's mythology, and we've discussed what Blinky represents. But it's worth adding one more thing. Blinky appeared in Season 2, which means Blinky has been the clearest piece of evidence that Springfield's environment is mutating living things for over 30 years of the show's run. Blinky appeared. The problem was noted. The problem was not solved. 34 years later, the plant is still running. The river is still downstream from the cooling towers. There are probably more Blinkies. Nobody is checking. The casualness with which the show has let Blinky's existence float in the background of Springfield's story for 3 decades is itself a form of commentary. Environmental damage does not announce itself dramatically and continuously. It sits in the background. It becomes familiar. The three-eyed fish stops being a scandal and starts being a local landmark. You take visitors to the river and point at the fish and say, "Yeah, that's because of the plant," and everybody nods and nobody does anything. And the visit continues. That's how environmental damage actually operates in communities dependent on the source of the damage. The Simpsons has been illustrating this for 34 years. Blinky keeps swimming. Nobody's moved. The chalkboard and what it costs Bart. Every episode, in the opening credits, Bart stands at a chalkboard in a classroom that is otherwise empty and writes the same sentence over and over again, varying from episode to episode, in the specific punishment assigned, but constant in its format. The gag is familiar. The punishment is visible. Bart writes. The audience reads. The joke lands. The sequence moves on. But the chalkboard gag, if you sit with it for a moment, contains something slightly unnerving. Bart is alone in the classroom. There are no other students. There is no teacher. The punishment has been assigned and then abandoned. Bart writes his sentence in the empty room with a mechanical patience that is entirely at odds with his usual impulsiveness, and then he leaves, and the world of Springfield opens around him. There are 2 ways to read this. One is simply as a formal device, a way of establishing Bart's character and the school's ongoing frustration with it in the opening sequence before the episode begins. This reading is fine. It is probably the correct primary reading. The other reading notices the specific quality of that solitude. Bart, the most social and externally directed of the Simpsons children, is placed alone in a room with his own transgression and required to acknowledge it, repetitively, in his own handwriting, with no audience. The punishment is not witnessed. The acknowledgement is not social. It is private. And the sentence he writes, whatever it is that week, is both the record of what he did wrong and, through repetition, something like an incantation. Writing something 20 times does not teach you not to do it. Bart knows this. The school presumably knows this. The ritual is performed anyway. This is a small thing, but it repeats every episode, which means it has been witnessed thousands of times by audiences who mostly read the joke and move on. The chalkboard gag is, over time, one of the show's most consistent pieces of visual language about what it means to be Bart Simpson. Mischievous, and known for it, and required to publicly acknowledge what you can never quite stop doing, in a room that is empty, because the punishment isn't really about changing you. It's about recording what you are. Section 13. The alternate Springfields. What the show imagined itself becoming future Simpsons. Episodes, and what they told us. The Simpsons has imagined its characters' futures several times across its run. Each of these imagined futures is a kind of prediction, not of real events, but of what the show believed its characters were capable of becoming. And the gap between who these characters are in their eternal present and who the futures imagine them to be is a measure of what the show understood about its own emotional possibilities. Lisa's Wedding, in Season 6, shows a future 2010 in which Lisa is a young woman at a British university engaged to a brilliant and somewhat stuffy English student named Hugh. The episode is written around a visit from Homer, who embarrasses Lisa in front of her fiancé's family in ways that are recognizable as Homer, while also being genuinely humiliating in the specific way that parental humiliation works when you're an adult who has moved past the person your parents know. The episode ends with the engagement breaking off, not because of Homer's behavior specifically, but because Hugh reveals that he looks down on Homer, and by extension, on the family Lisa came from. Lisa realizes that she cannot marry someone who is embarrassed by where she's from. The episode concludes with Lisa and Homer in a quiet moment, Homer promising to be at her real wedding, whenever it happens. The emotional core of this episode is not the prediction of 2010, or the satirical vision of early internet culture, or the comedy of Homer in England. It is the specific quality of the father-daughter relationship. Homer loves Lisa in a way that he cannot always access, and that she cannot always receive. But that is real and deep, and worth choosing even when the choice is inconvenient. The imagined future is a device for getting at something true about the present. The show uses the distance of decades to say things about this family that are harder to say while everyone is standing in the same kitchen. Bart to the Future, in Season 11, imagines the year 2030, in which Lisa is President of the United States, dealing with a national debt crisis, and Bart is an aging slacker who hasn't made anything of himself. The episode is primarily remembered for introducing the line about the country having been left broke by its previous president, followed by the revelation that the previous president was Donald Trump. This is the prediction that everyone knows. But the emotional content of the episode, which is primarily about Bart and what happens when someone who was defined by potential uses that potential to make as little of themselves as possible, is what gives the episode its actual weight. Bart chose every fork in the road that led away from growth. The future shows you where that road ends. It is not a dark place exactly. Bart is not miserable. He is simply less than he could have been. And the show looks at that without judgment but without sentimentality either. These future episodes are, in aggregate, a portrait of what The Simpsons believed its own characters were for. Lisa is the future. She is the character through whom the show's hopefulness is channeled. Whatever happens in Springfield, Lisa is going somewhere. She is going to be president, or a musician, or a scientist, or some combination of things that take her out of Springfield and into the larger world. The eternal present freezes her at 8, but the imagined futures keep showing you who 8-year-old Lisa is building herself to become. Bart is the character through whom the show's ambivalence about potential is channeled. He is brilliant in ways that Springfield doesn't reward. He is creative and perceptive and capable, and he makes choices that keep him small. The futures show you different versions of what those choices produce. Sometimes he finds his way, sometimes he doesn't. The show doesn't resolve this because the show understands that Bart's trajectory is genuinely undetermined, in a way that Lisa's is not. Lisa is going to do something remarkable. Bart is going to do something that entirely depends on a series of choices he hasn't made yet. The Treehouse of Horror as emotional laboratory. We talked about Treehouse of Horror earlier, at the surface level, as a tradition and a formal experiment. But there's a deeper function these episodes serve that becomes clear only when you've watched enough of them to see the patterns. The Treehouse episodes are where the show allows itself to experience emotions it normally can't sustain. Specifically, they are where the show allows its characters to die and to grieve and to face consequences with genuine weight. And then they are where the show absolves itself of those emotional investments by placing them outside the regular continuity. Homer dies in Treehouse episodes constantly. The deaths are played with varying degrees of weight. Some are pure comedy. Some are genuinely moving. The episode in which Homer is sent to hell after selling his soul for a donut, and then is condemned to eat an infinite supply of donuts as his punishment, and then enjoys this enormously, is comedy. But there are Treehouse segments in which the deaths feel like something more than comedy. in which the show uses the safety of the non-canonical space to examine what it would actually mean to lose these characters. There is a Treehouse segment in which Homer is actually dead, a ghost haunting his own house, trying to reach Marge through the supernatural barrier between his state and hers. The segment is played comedically, but its emotional premise is a love story about two people separated by the most permanent possible separation and still trying, across it, to hold on to each other. That's not a Halloween joke. That's a story about marriage and loss, given the freedom of the non-canonical to be honest in ways the regular show cannot afford. The Treehouse episodes also serve as a testing ground for tonal experiments that occasionally migrate into the regular show. Techniques developed in the non-canonical space, ways of holding sadness and comedy simultaneously, ways of allowing consequence without destroying the premise, are sometimes imported back into regular episodes. The Treehouse episodes are where the show practices being different from itself, and occasionally, that practice produces something that becomes part of what the show permanently is. What happened to the B stories? One of the structural choices that separates The Simpsons at its best from The Simpsons in its later years is the management of the B story. Classic Simpsons episodes typically have two narrative threads running simultaneously, a primary story focusing on one character, and a secondary story, usually involving different characters, that comments on or contrasts with the primary story in ways that enrich both. The greatest B stories in the show's history work through counterpoint. The primary story is about Homer feeling underappreciated at work. The B story is about Lisa learning something about being seen by others. The two stories illuminate each other. The emotional content of one deepens the emotional content of the other. When they converge in the final minutes, they do so with more resonance than either would have had alone. This requires careful construction. The B story must be substantial enough to carry genuine comic and emotional weight, but not so substantial that it overshadows the main narrative. The connections between the two stories must be real, but not obvious. The resolution must serve both narratives simultaneously, without feeling forced. At its best, the classic Simpsons achieved this balance with extraordinary consistency. The B stories were constructed with the care and attention that lesser shows gave only to their main plots. They had their own arcs, their own punchlines, their own emotional moments. They were, in miniature, complete stories. In the show's later seasons, this balance frequently tips. B stories become thinner, more clearly functional, sometimes almost perfunctory. The main plot expands to fill the time available, becoming more elaborate in ways that substitute complication for depth. The comic machinery becomes more visible because it is doing more structural work with less emotional reinforcement. This shift is worth naming not to criticize the later show, but to understand what was being lost. The B story, at its best, was the show's way of saying that there was always more than one thing happening in Springfield. That while Homer was having his adventure, Marge was having hers. And their simultaneous existence, their parallel processing of the world, was part of what made Springfield feel inhabited rather than merely plotted. When the B story weakens, Springfield becomes a little more like a stage set and a little less like a place. The richness of simultaneity, the sense that many stories are always in progress, is one of the things that made the show feel real. And it was achieved largely through the management of a narrative device that most viewers absorbed without ever naming it. Section 14. What the show says about class. Homer and the working class. The Simpsons is, at its foundational level, a working-class show. Homer Simpson earns a salary that the show has occasionally specified, and that, when those specifications are examined, is genuinely not a lot of money for a family of 5 in an American city with a nuclear power plant. The family is not destitute. They own a house. They have a car. The children attend public school and eat regular meals. But money is a consistent source of anxiety in the early seasons. Bills are mentioned, budgets are discussed. Homer's salary, which he has never managed to significantly increase through the length of his career, is the ceiling of what the family can afford. The show's class consciousness is one of its defining qualities and one of the things that distinguishes it from most American television. American television has historically been uncomfortable with class, in a way that European television is not. Shows set at the working class tend to either romanticize it, treating working class life as a source of noble simplicity and communal warmth, or to use it as a ladder from which characters escape upward into the middle class. The Simpsons does neither. It depicts working class life in Springfield as simply the water the characters swim in. They are not going upward. They are not defined by noble simplicity. They are living their specific lives with the specific resources they have. And the limits of those resources are real. Homer's relationship with wealth, and with people who have it, is one of the show's consistent sources of both comedy and genuine pathos. His encounters with Burns, his occasional access to higher-class experiences, his periodic attempts to upgrade his situation, all produce comedy from the gap between aspiration and circumstance. But the show is careful never to position Homer as deserving of more than he has. He is not a diamond in the rough waiting to be discovered. He is a man whose life is what it is, and the show respects that life by taking it seriously. Marge's class anxiety is handled differently and with equal care. Marge grew up aspiring to a certain kind of middle-class respectability that Springfield doesn't quite provide, and that her marriage to Homer has not moved toward. There are episodes in which Marge encounters the social world of wealthier Springfield residents and experiences the specific pain of recognizing that she would like to belong to it, and that she doesn't quite. These episodes are never simple. The show doesn't celebrate Marge's return to her own life as a triumph of authenticity over aspiration. It allows her the complexity of genuinely wanting something she can't have, while also genuinely loving the life she has. The show's treatment of Burns as a representative of a certain kind of American wealth is part of this same class consciousness. Burns is not simply evil. He is what happens when wealth becomes old enough and entrenched enough that it ceases to have any relationship to the rest of the economy except as a force that operates on it. Burns does not worry about money in the way Homer does. Burns does not worry about money in any way at all. Money, for Burns, is the medium through which he expresses power, not a constraint he navigates. This is the actual experience of extreme wealth, and the show depicts it with consistency across hundreds of episodes. The gap between Homer's relationship to money and Burns's relationship to money is the gap between the working class and true capital, rendered in a cartoon. Springfield's middle and why it keeps shrinking. Ned Flanders is, financially, comfortable. He runs a successful small business. His house is well maintained. He can afford things Homer cannot. But he is not wealthy in any way that distances him from the ordinary concerns of his neighbors. He is the show's portrait of the economically stable middle, the person who has achieved financial security through discipline and work, and has turned that security into a modest but genuine quality of life. The show has, across its run, depicted the middle of Springfield's economic spectrum with a consistency that reflects something real about American economic development since 1989. The stability that Ned represents has become harder to achieve. The show doesn't comment on this directly. It simply continues to depict Springfield, and Springfield in 2025 looks like Springfield in 1989 because the floating timeline protects the show from having to reckon with what 3.5 decades of economic change would do to a community like Ned's. But the very fact that Ned exists, that there is a character whose modest prosperity is treated as attainable and worthy of depicting, is itself a statement. The Simpsons came from a moment when it was possible to build a television show around the premise that a nuclear safety inspector with limited education could own a house and support a family and live, if not prosperously, then adequately. That premise has aged. The world the show was born into has changed in ways the show's frozen timeline doesn't acknowledge. And the gap between what Springfield depicts and what an actual American working-class town of the same profile would look like in 2025 is itself a kind of commentary, though one the show makes by omission rather than by engagement. Section 15. The Closing Layers. What stays with you? The show's relationship with goodbye. The Simpsons has said goodbye many times. Like characters have died, relationships have ended, episodes have concluded with genuine finality before the reset arrived. And the show has developed, across all of these goodbyes, a specific way of handling them that has become one of its most distinctive emotional gestures. The gesture is restraint. When the show does its best goodbye work, it refuses to underline. It does not build to a swelling musical climax. It does not give the departing character a speech. It finds a small, specific, human moment and lets that moment do the work of everything larger that it would take a less confident show 3 scenes to express. Homer visiting his mother's grave after her death. The scene is almost nothing. Homer stands at the headstone. He says something small. He leaves. The music doesn't tell you what to feel. The camera doesn't linger in a way that instructs emotion. You just watch Homer leave, and the leaving carries everything. Bleeding Gums Murphy's death, which Lisa processes through music. She plays his song on television. He hears it from his hospital room. They never see each other again. The connection is made and then the connection is gone. And the music, which continues, is all that crosses the gap. The end of the episode Mother Simpson, in which Mona has fled again and Homer can't go after her. The episode ends with Homer sitting on the hood of his car outside the house, looking up. Looking at nothing. Looking at where she was and where she went. The image holds. The credits roll. Nobody says anything. The silence is the goodbye, and it is complete. These moments accumulate over 36 seasons into a body of quiet grief that the show carries without ever fully expressing. The characters don't grieve out loud. Springfield doesn't hold funerals for its collective losses. The goodbyes happen in these small, restrained moments that the show trusts its audience to feel. And the audience does feel them. Because the small goodbye, the one that refuses to be large, is the one that gets inside you. You don't defend against it. You're not prepared. You're watching a cartoon, and then something in you cracks open a little. And then the show moves on, and you move on with it, carrying something you didn't have before. That is the show's most profound achievement. Not its comedy, which is remarkable. Not its satire, which is sharp. Not its prediction record or its production scale or its longevity. The small goodbyes, the moments it trusted you with, the restraint with which it handed you something real and let you feel it on your own terms. The yellow skin and what it means to be seen. Every character in Springfield is yellow. We discussed this in the context of the radiation theory, where it serves as evidence of mutation. But the yellow skin has another dimension that is worth sitting with separately. Groening has said that the yellow skin was a practical animation decision, made to ensure that the characters were immediately recognizable, even when a viewer was channel surfing. Yellow human skin reads immediately as The Simpsons. You cannot mistake it for another show. The yellow is a brand mark as much as a design choice. But design choices that begin as practical decisions take on meaning over time. The yellow skin of Springfield's residents has been, for 36 years, the visual signature of a community. It is what they look like. It is how they are drawn. And the consistency of it, across every character, across every season, has produced a visual community that is, within its own logic, coherent and specific and real. When outside characters arrive in Springfield with more realistically drawn features, the contrast is visible. We've discussed what the radiation theory makes of this. But even without any theoretical lens, the contrast produces a specific feeling. The outsiders look like they belong to a different category. They have proportions that don't quite match the world they've entered. They are, visually, not from here. And the Springfield residents, yellow and four-fingered and disproportionate as they are from here. They belong to this place in a way that the more realistically drawn visitors do not. Their appearance is evidence of their belonging. The mutations, if you choose to read them that way, are also the marks of community. The shared strangeness is the shared identity. This is not entirely unlike how communities actually work. The things that mark a community as different from the outside world, whether those are accents or customs or specific cultural references or shared histories, are simultaneously the things that make the community legible to its members. Springfield residents recognize each other. They can read the local codes. They know what the yellow skin means, which is, you're from here. You belong here. This is your place. And Burns, who is from here in the sense of having built it and maintained it and never left it, is also yellow. He is a member of the community he has exploited. He shares its visual language. He is drawn with the same design grammar as every other Springfield resident. The man who poisons the town is also, visually, part of the town. His poison is also his membership. The harm and the belonging are, in Springfield as in so many real places, inseparable. The show's future and what it owes its past. The Simpsons will produce more episodes. It has been renewed through season 38, as of the last available information, and there is no strong indication that the machinery will stop before it has to. The show is still commercially viable. The voice actors are still contracted. The production pipeline is still functioning. Springfield is still there. What the show owes its past is a genuinely interesting question. Not in any moral sense, because a television show doesn't have obligations in the way a person does. but in the sense of what the show would need to do to be worthy of the enormous body of work that preceded it. What would it mean for a season 38 episode to feel like it belonged in the same conversation as Homer the Heretic, or Cape Fear, or Mother Simpson? The honest answer might be that this is no longer the standard to aim for. The show has been too many things for too long to be evaluated against its own highest points. The better question is whether it continues to produce individual moments of genuine quality. A scene, a joke, a piece of music, a small goodbye, that reminds you of what the show at its best could do. And by that standard, the show has continued to succeed more consistently than its harshest critics acknowledge. The show's future is also Springfield's future, and Springfield's future is, in the floating timeline, also Springfield's past. The town will not change. The family will not age. The plant will keep running. Homer will keep going to work. Marge will keep waiting. Bart will keep finding trouble. Lisa will keep playing her saxophone. Maggie will keep watching. And somewhere, in a way that nobody in Springfield can quite see, all of it will keep meaning something. Something about who we are and how we live and what we hold on to when the world tries to take things from us. Something about the specific weight of a family that stays together through everything. Not because staying together is always right, but because it is what they choose. Day after day, season after season, for as long as the story lasts. The show will end, or it won't. Either way, Springfield will remain, somewhere between everywhere and nowhere on any real map, in the yellow light of the nuclear plant's perpetual operation, in the amber of the floating timeline, in the dream of the man on the hospital bed who just wants to go home to Evergreen Terrace. It's late. The lights are low, if you've made it all the way here, to the very bottom of this iceberg, through every theory and every history and every small moment of genuine feeling that this show has left in its enormous wake, then you understand, maybe more than you did before, why this particular cartoon about a yellow family in a yellow town has lasted as long as it has. Because it was always about more than the cartoon. It was always about the family on the couch. Theirs and ours. Sleep well. Springfield will be there in the morning. Section 16. The secondary cast and the world they built. Kent Brockman and the media. Kent Brockman is Springfield's television news anchor. He has been delivering the news from Channel 6 since the show began, and he has, across 36 years of background appearances and occasional spotlight moments, developed into one of the most quietly devastating satirical portraits in the show's history. The joke about Kent is simple. He is a news anchor who has no particular commitment to truth. He reports what he's told. He pivots to whatever the story needs him to say without any visible internal conflict. He announced, based on what appeared to be radar evidence, that an ant colony of enormous size had taken over the Earth, and he welcomed his new insect overlords on live television without hesitation. The scene is played for comedy, but the comedy is rooted in something real about the relationship between television journalism and the stories it chooses to tell. Brockman is not corrupt in the way that Burns is corrupt. He does not have a scheme. He is not secretly working against the town's interests. He is simply a man who has understood, completely and without apparent distress, that his job is to perform the appearance of journalism, rather than to do journalism. He stands in front of a camera. He reads what is given to him. He looks authoritative. He uses the correct intonations to signal significance or levity or concern, depending on what the segment requires. And he does all of this with such practiced ease that it is genuinely difficult to tell, from the outside, whether he has any authentic opinions about anything at all. The show has given Brockman moments of apparent sincerity that then deflate into performance. He will make a speech about journalistic integrity and immediately accept a bribe. He will express genuine concern about a Springfield crisis and then segue without transition to a piece about amusing animals. He is a kind of test case for the show's recurring interest in the gap between the appearance of civic responsibility and its substance. Springfield has civic institutions. It has a police force and a court system and a media and a government. None of these institutions function the way they claim to function. All of them maintain the performance of their function while failing to actually perform it. Brockman is the media arm of this institutional performance. His presence in Springfield's information ecosystem means that residents who watch the news receive a version of reality that has been processed through the requirements of the broadcast format. Dramatic, immediate, easily digestible, and not particularly connected to the truth of what is happening. This is not a satire that has aged poorly. If anything, it has aged into sharper focus. What makes Brockman interesting rather than simply cynical is that the show never makes him fully villainous. He is not malicious. He is not actively deceiving the public as a project. He simply does his job as he has always understood his job, and his understanding of his job happens to include essentially no commitment to accuracy. He is a man who found a role that fit his talents, which are considerable, and settled into it, and the fact that the role is somewhat dishonest has never been something he needed to actively reconcile, because he never experienced it as a conflict to begin with. That is, in some ways, the most disturbing reading of him. Not that he chose to mislead, but that the question never came up. Krusty the Clown and performance as identity. Herschel Schmoikel Kristofsky is a television clown named Krusty, who has been entertaining Springfield's children for longer than most of them have been alive. He is also, underneath the makeup and the suit and the relentless performance of children's entertainment, one of the most deeply unhappy characters in the show's universe. Krusty's unhappiness is not simple. It is not the unhappiness of a man who wanted to be something else and settled. It is the unhappiness of a man who became exactly what he wanted to be and discovered that what he wanted to be was not, by itself, sufficient to make him well. He is a celebrity. His show is popular. He has money and recognition and access to the kinds of experiences that financial success in the entertainment industry provides. And he is also addicted, despairing, alienated from his audience, alienated from his family, alienated from the Judaism that his father, a rabbi, represents. The relationship between Krusty and his father, Rabbi Hyman Kristofsky, is one of the show's most sustained emotional threads. The rabbi is ashamed of his son's choice to become a clown. Krusty is wounded by his father's disapproval, and has been for his entire professional life. The estrangement between them is not a minor subplot. It is, the show suggests, the source of much of Krusty's damage. He became a performer partly in defiance of his father and partly out of a genuine love of making people laugh. And the entanglement of those two motivations, the genuine talent and the unresolved wound, has produced a man whose public persona is one of cheerful entertainment and whose private life is a study in unmanaged self-destruction. The episode in which Bart reconciles Krusty with his father, using specific Talmudic reasoning to argue that comedy is a legitimate form of joy in the world, is one of the show's most earnest achievements. The reconciliation is played with genuine warmth. The father and son embrace. Something old and painful is resolved. And then the show moves on, and Krusty returns to his usual existence, and the reconciliation is part of the archive but not part of what defines his daily life. This is, again, the show's specific relationship with emotional resolution. The resolution happened, it was real, it counts, and Krusty is still Krusty, still doing the show, still unhappy in the ways he was unhappy before the reconciliation. Because the wound was not the only thing, and the healing of the wound was not the whole story. He is a complicated person, more complicated than a children's television clown should be, and the show keeps that complication alive through every season it gives him. Krusty also functions as the show's meditation on celebrity and what it does to the relationship between public and private self. He has been on television his entire adult life. His public image, the clown, is more famous than any individual aspect of his actual person. When people meet Krusty, they meet the performance first, and the person distantly, if at all. This is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from fame. The loneliness of being known for the thing you do in public, rather than for what you are when you're not performing. And Krusty's alcoholism, his gambling, his failed relationships, all of these exist in the space between the public clown and the private man. They are what happens in the room where the makeup comes off. Barney, Lenny, and Carl, and the men around Homer. Homer's social world is built around a specific geography. Moe's Tavern, the plant, the couch. The men who populate these spaces are among the show's most consistent secondary characters, and each of them offers a different inflection of what working-class male friendship looks like in Springfield. Lenny Leonard and Carl Carlson are Homer's closest work friends. They share a dynamic that the show has maintained across hundreds of background appearances and occasional spotlight episodes. They are devoted to each other in a way that the show has always positioned ambiguously, sometimes as simple close friendship, sometimes as something that might be more, without ever committing fully to either reading. The show knows this ambiguity is there. It has referenced it directly, jokingly, in multiple episodes, and it has chosen to leave the ambiguity intact rather than resolving it, because the ambiguity is more interesting than any resolution. Lenny, specifically, is a character whose background the show reveals in fragments that never quite cohere into a consistent biography, but that accumulate into a portrait of someone with an unexpectedly complicated inner life. He has a master's degree in something. He has a profound fear of losing an eye that has persisted across many episodes, usually played for comedy, but occasionally played with a seriousness that suggests genuine anxiety beneath the running gag. He is, in these fragments, someone with more depth than his role in the Springfield social ecology might suggest. Carl is harder to read because the show has historically given him less to do. He is, in many episodes, primarily a straight man for Homer and Lenny. But in the episodes where he is given space, he reveals a quality of quiet thoughtfulness that distinguishes him from the rest of Homer's immediate circle. He is, among the plant workers, probably the most emotionally articulate. The show has used this intermittently, and it remains one of the untapped resources of the Springfield supporting cast. Moe Sheslack is the character who lives most explicitly in the gap between who he is and who he wants to be. He is a bartender who has never achieved anything he set out to achieve. He has invented things that were stolen from him. He has had relationships that have dissolved. He has aspirations toward a kind of dignity that the universe seems to specifically deny him. Moe is not simply a joke. He is the show's portrait of failure that is structural rather than personal. The failure that comes from having the wrong starting conditions, from being the kind of person the world sorts into the background, while the more fortunate people move toward the center. His loneliness is consistent and real. The show has occasionally given him moments of genuine warmth and connection, and then taken those moments away, not cruelly but with the casual efficiency of a story that keeps resetting. What stays about Moe is not any particular event, but the accumulation of who he is. Loyal, frustrated, sometimes kind, sometimes cowardly, permanently situated on the wrong side of every lucky break, and still showing up every day to open the bar. Section 17. The show and its audience. A relationship across time. What changes when you watch it older? There is a specific experience that longtime Simpsons viewers report, which is the experience of returning to an episode they watched as children and finding something completely different in it. Not a different episode, not a different show, the same episode, but the emotional content of it has shifted. Things that were background noise have become significant. Things that were purely funny have become also sad. The comedic surface is still there, but underneath it, a layer has opened that was sealed when you were watching it as a 10-year-old. This experience is more acute with The Simpsons than with most childhood television, because the show was, from the beginning, written for adults. The jokes the adults laughed at and the jokes the children laughed at often occupied the same line of dialogue. The children got the obvious layer. The adults got the layer underneath. And when a child who watched the show grows up, they find themselves, on rewatch, suddenly receiving both layers simultaneously. The Season 1 episode Bart the Genius, in which Bart cheats his way into a gifted school and spends the episode drowning in material he can't understand while pretending to belong, is very funny to a child, because Bart is in over his head in ways that produce physical comedy. It is different to watch as an adult because you now have the experience of being in rooms where you felt like an imposter, where you were performing competence you didn't possess, where you were terrified that someone would notice you didn't belong. The episode is still funny. It is also now a precise psychological portrait of imposter syndrome. Both things are true simultaneously. The episode didn't change. You changed. And the show was built to accommodate both versions of you. The Simpsons has a specific relationship with its aging audience that no other animated show has managed, simply because no other animated show has run long enough to track the same audience through multiple life stages. People who were 8 years old when the show premiered are now in their 40s. Their children have watched the show. Their parents, in some cases, watched it with them in 1989. The show has been a multi-generational experience for many families, each generation receiving a different show, even though they are literally watching the same episodes. This multi-generational dimension is one of the things that makes the show's cultural footprint genuinely unusual. It is not simply that the show lasted a long time. It is that it lasted long enough to become a family inheritance for some viewers. A thing that was given to you by your parents or your older siblings, and that you will eventually share with people younger than you. The show as cultural transmission. The couch gag is something your kids will recognize before they understand it. The fan community and what it made. The community of people who care deeply about The Simpsons is one of the oldest active fan communities in internet history. The Usenet groups that first formed around the show in the early 1990s predated the World Wide Web. The episode guides, the quotation archives, the detailed continuity analyses. All of this emerged from people who cared enough to build it before the infrastructure for doing so was particularly well developed. The Simpsons fan community is unusual because it encompasses both the people who love the show for its early seasons and are ambivalent or hostile toward recent ones, and the people who came to the show through syndication or streaming and have a different relationship to its timeline and quality. These two groups do not always agree about what the show is or what it should be, but they share a specific language. The show gave its community an enormous shared lexicon. The references, the catchphrases, the specific callbacks that function as cultural passwords among people who watch the same television. This lexicon is one of the things that distinguishes Simpsons fandom from fandoms built around other properties. The vocabulary is enormous, and it is embedded deeply in the culture beyond the fandom itself. The fan theories we discussed in detail earlier are products of this community. The coma theory, the radiation theory, the various readings of Who Shot Mr. Burns. All of these began as someone noticing something and writing it down, and others reading it and adding to it. They are collaborative intellectual projects built in fan spaces over decades. The best of them are as rigorous as academic analysis of literary texts, more rigorous in some cases, because the people doing the work are motivated by genuine love of the material rather than by professional necessity. The community has also preserved things that the official archive has not. When episodes have been altered, when segments have been removed, when the show's streaming presentation has differed from its original broadcast, fans have documented the differences and kept the original versions accessible in various forms. They are, in a real sense, the show's memory. Springfield forgets. The fans remember. This is not accidental. It is the natural result of building a community around a show that made noticing things the primary pleasure of engagement. Section 18. Deeper into Burns, the man who built the town. Burns's childhood and what the show reveals. Mr. Burns did not always have absolute power. There was a time before the empire, before the nuclear plant, before the century of systematic exploitation. There was a child named Charles Montgomery Burns, and the show has glimpsed that child across multiple episodes in ways that are, collectively, one of the more complex origin stories in American animation. What the show reveals about Burns's childhood is fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, because Burns is a character whose past has been layered across decades of writing by different teams who were not always coordinating. But the fragments cohere around certain things. Burns grew up wealthy. The family's wealth predated anything Burns himself built. He was shaped from the beginning by the assumption that wealth was the natural condition of his existence, and that everyone else's relative poverty was the natural condition of their existence. This was not something he was taught so much as something that was simply atmospheric in the household he grew up in. The hierarchy was the air. He had a bear as a child, a stuffed bear named Bobo, whose reappearance in the episode Rosebud, a parody of Citizen Kane, is one of the show's most effective emotional gambits. Rosebud operates as a meditation on what childhood innocence means when it is placed inside a life of extraordinary privilege and then lost. Burns searches for the bear with the resources of a billionaire, deploying surveillance and bribery and institutional power in service of something that is, at its core, simply a man wanting to feel the specific safety of being a child again. The bear is the thing he was before he became Burns, and the show allows him to retrieve it, briefly, at great cost to others, before he loses it again. The Rosebud episode asks you to feel something about Burns that the show normally doesn't ask for. It asks you to hold his humanity for 22 minutes, to sit with the idea that the billionaire who runs the plant and poisons the town and fires his only loyal employee when it suits him, was also once a small child who loved a stuffed bear. These things are both true. They do not cancel each other out. They coexist in the same person, as they coexist in most people. The damage done, and the damaged person doing it, and somewhere underneath both, the child who hadn't done anything yet. The show does not ask you to forgive Burns on the basis of Bobo. It simply asks you to see him fully for 22 minutes. And then it resets, as it always resets, and Burns is restored to his function as Springfield's chief antagonist, and Bobo is somewhere in the river again, and the glimpse of something human closes over. Smithers and the nature of devotion. We have discussed Smithers as a practical necessity, as the person who keeps Burns alive through logistical management. But Smithers deserves more than that reading, because his devotion to Burns is one of the show's most consistent and most genuinely complex long-running character threads. Smithers loves Burns. The show has circled this fact for 36 seasons, sometimes directly and sometimes obliquely, and its final settled position is that yes, Waylon Smithers is in love with his employer in a way that is unrequited and that he has organized his entire life around. This reading was made explicit in later seasons when the show was able to be more direct about what it had previously coded. Smithers came out, eventually, or the show allowed him to be out, and while the specific target of his affections shifted in that storyline, the foundational devotion to Burns remained. The tragedy of Smithers is not that he loves someone who doesn't love him back. That tragedy is common and survivable. The deeper tragedy is that his love has become the organizing principle of his life in a way that has foreclosed other possibilities. He has constructed his identity around service to a man who, in his best moments, regards him as exceptionally useful and, in his worst, regards him as furniture. Smithers knows this. He is not deluded about the nature of Burns's feelings. He serves anyway. The service is its own end. The show has occasionally given Smithers the opportunity to leave, to go elsewhere, to build a life around something other than Burns. He has taken these opportunities and found them insufficient. He returns. The returning is not presented as weakness, exactly, though it has elements of weakness in it. It is presented as something more complicated, the return of someone who has discovered, through departure, that the devotion is what he is, and that being elsewhere from it does not make him more himself. It makes him less. There is something genuinely sad about this that the show handles with more tenderness than it might. Smithers is not mocked for his devotion. He is not made a fool of in the way that unrequited love is often treated in comedy. The show respects the sincerity of his attachment even while acknowledging its costs. He chose this. He keeps choosing it. And choice, the show has always understood, is a form of meaning even when the choice is painful. Section 19. The show's treatment of death and mortality. The characters who were supposed to die. There is a documented piece of the show's early development history that suggests the show came very close to killing off a major character in its third season. The character who was slated for death was not a minor figure. It was a member of the immediate family. The idea was proposed, discussed, and ultimately rejected. But the fact that it was seriously considered tells you something about where the show's creators thought it might go. The specific character who was discussed as a candidate for permanent death varies depending on which account you read, but the most consistent version identifies Marge as the character who was briefly considered. The storyline would have involved her dying, and the show would have followed Homer as a widower trying to raise his children alone. This premise was eventually adapted into a shorter form. The one-hour episode special in Season 5, Bart Gets Famous, touches on some elements of what life without Marge's organizing presence would look like. But the full version, the permanent version, was never made. What the consideration of this storyline reveals is that the early show understood itself to be capable of genuine irreversibility. The people making it in those first seasons had not yet fully committed to the reset as the show's fundamental operating principle. They were still imagining, occasionally, a Simpsons that could change in permanent ways. The rejection of Marge's death was the moment when the show fully chose the other path, chose the loop, chose the eternal present, and everything since has been the consequence of that choice. The alternative show, the one where Marge died in Season 3, and Homer raised Bart and Lisa and Maggie alone, is one of the great unmade television programs. Not because it would necessarily have been better than what was made, but because it would have been entirely different, and the version of the show that came from that loss would have been shaped by it in ways that would have been irreversible, cumulative, and real in the way that real loss is real. That show would have ended. Not in the sense of being canceled, but in the natural sense of a story that moves through time and arrives somewhere. It would have had a direction, a destination. The show that was made instead has had neither. It has had adventures. It has had moments of beauty, and moments of comedy, and moments of genuine darkness. But it has not had a direction. It has been its own direction. And for 36 years, the audience has traveled alongside it. Not toward anything, simply alongside. Which is, the show has always understood, how most of life actually works. The dead who stay present. The Simpsons has a specific relationship with its dead that is different from how death is usually handled in television. In most shows, dead characters are gone. They may appear in flashbacks or be referenced in dialogue, but their absence is real and continuous. In Springfield, the dead have a different quality. They are gone, and they are also still here, in the way that people who mattered to us are still here after they leave. Bleeding Gums Murphy appears to Lisa after his death. He speaks to her through the music she finds. He is not simply gone. He is transformed into something that continues to reach her. This is played with the show's characteristic mixture of comedy and earnest feeling, and it works because the show has established that Springfield is a place where the boundaries between presence and absence are genuinely porous. Homer's mother is dead, and she continues to matter in every episode where Homer's psychology is at issue. The way he loves Marge, the way he holds his family, the fear that drives his clinginess, all of this carries Mona Simpson in it even when she is not directly referenced. The dead live in the consequences they left. This is how the show honors them, not through revisitation, but through the ongoing presence of what they changed in the people who love them. Even Frank Grimes, who appeared in one episode and was killed in that episode and never returned, remains present in the show's memory, in the sense that every episode where Homer's unearned good fortune is visible carries the ghost of Grimes's frustrated disbelief. He was the show's acknowledgement of its own absurdity. His death was the show's way of saying, "Yes, we see you," the viewer who keeps asking why this man is okay. We see you, and we cannot answer. Frank Grimes lives in that unanswered question. He lives in the silence where the answer should be. Section 20. The Long Goodbye. Making Sense of 36 Years. What the show got right about America. The Simpsons premiered at a specific moment in American history. The Cold War was ending. The economy was entering a period of growth that would persist through much of the 90s. The culture was confident and expansive in ways it would not remain. And into this moment, the show inserted its portrait of Springfield, which was not a portrait of confidence or expansion, but of the specific strain that American life put on the people at its middle levels. Homer's anxiety about money in the early seasons reflects something real about the late 80s and early 90s. The apparent prosperity of the era coexisted with a widespread sense of precariousness among working-class and middle-class families, a sense that the prosperity was available but not necessarily to them, that the good times were happening slightly above their economic altitude. Homer works hard and gets by. He is not failing, but the margin is narrow, and the narrowness is present in every episode that involves a bill or a repair or an unexpected expense. The show got right, across its run, the specific texture of American civic dysfunction. The police are not evil, but they are useless. The government is not malicious, but it is captured. The media is not lying, but it is not quite telling the truth. The schools are not terrible, but they are underfunded. The courts are not corrupt, but they are susceptible to money. These are the specific, modest failures of democratic institutions under ordinary conditions, not the grand failures of totalitarianism, but the daily friction of systems that were never quite adequate to the tasks assigned to them. The show also got right, with particular consistency, the role of money in determining the texture of everyday experience. Burns's Springfield is not a place where poverty is extreme in the way of genuine deprivation. Nobody starves. Nobody lacks shelter. But the presence of an economic hierarchy is visible and felt constantly. The kids at the good schools know they go to the good school. The people who live in the better neighborhoods know where they live. And Burns, at the top, operates in a different reality entirely, one in which the ordinary constraints of material life have simply ceased to apply. This economic portrait has remained accurate in its broad outlines across 3.5 decades, because the dynamics it captures are structural rather than situational. The specific anxieties have changed. The specific mechanisms have evolved. But the fundamental shape, in which a small number of people have access to resources that insulate them from consequence, while a much larger number live within constraints that the smaller group helped to design, has not changed. Springfield in 2025 is, structurally, not very different from Springfield in 1989, and neither is America. The emotional truth the show carried. After everything, after 36 seasons and every theory, and every death, and every reset, and every yellow face, and every cracked cooling tower, What The Simpsons was really about was something very simple. It was about the people you didn't choose and couldn't leave. It was about the specific love that develops between family members who are, by any rational assessment, not ideally suited to each other. The love that grows not from compatibility, but from exposure, from time, from the accumulation of shared experience that cannot be transferred to anyone else because it belongs specifically to this combination of people. Homer loves Marge in a way that makes no particular sense in the abstract. He is not her intellectual equal. He is not reliably kind, or reliably thoughtful, or reliably any of the things that relationship advice would tell you a partner should be. He loves her the way a person loves someone they have built themselves around. The way a person loves someone whose absence would not simply cause grief, but would require them to become an entirely different person to survive. The love is structural. It is load-bearing. Remove it and the whole edifice of who Homer is collapses. Marge loves Homer with what looks like patience, but is actually something more interesting. The specific decision, renewed continuously, to see someone accurately and choose them anyway. She knows who he is. She has no illusions. The love is not maintained by illusion. It is maintained by choice, by the daily recommitment to this man, and this family, and this couch, because the alternative is not something else worth having. The alternative is the absence of what they have, and the absence is worth less than the presence. Even complicated, even imperfect, even with the cracked cooling towers, and the crayon in the brain, and the billionaire who cannot remember your name. The children love their parents in the way that children who are becoming their own people love the people they are becoming distinct from. Bart's love for Homer is inseparable from his conflict with Homer. The conflict is how he knows he exists separately from his father, and the love is how he knows the separation is okay. He is becoming someone. His father is who he's becoming someone other than. That's the function of the relationship, and it is performed with complete fidelity to how these dynamics actually work. Lisa's love for Homer is perhaps the most painful kind of love the show depicts. The love of a brilliant child for a parent who cannot meet her where she is. Homer cannot understand Lisa. He tries, sometimes. He fails consistently, but the trying matters, and Lisa knows it matters, and the gap between what he can give and what she needs is the gap she lives in. She does not close it. She cannot close it. She loves him across it. Maggie's love for her family is the most wordless and therefore the most total. She watches them all. She understands things about each of them that they don't understand about themselves. And she loves them not despite the complications and the failures and the radiation and the reset button, but through all of that, in full knowledge of what they are. Her silence is not withholding. Her silence is the love that exceeds language. This is what the show was always about. This yellow family on a couch in a town that doesn't exist on any map. This imperfect, chosen, irreplaceable configuration of people who are, despite everything, still there, still together, still stumbling through the same opening credits every Sunday night at 8 o'clock, landing on the same couch, in the same house, in the same town, in the same light that the nuclear plant casts over everything. They are not fine. They are not okay in all the ways that matter, but they are together, and in Springfield, and perhaps beyond Springfield, that has always been enough to keep the story going. That is the bottom of the iceberg. That is what you find when you go all the way down. Not the radiation, not the coma, not the mystery of who shot Mr. Burns or how Burns stays alive, or where Springfield is on the map. Those are interesting. Those are worth the journey. But what you find at the very bottom, past all the theories and all the history and all the production secrets and all the real tragedy and all the small goodbyes, is a family, sitting on a couch, watching television, together. And the couch, after all these years, is still warm. Section 21. The episodes that define decades. The best episodes of the 90s and what made them. There is a hierarchy of quality in The Simpsons that even the show's defenders and critics tend to agree upon at the level of individual episodes. Certain things were produced during the show's first decade that achieved a completeness, a balance of comedy and feeling and structure that has never been equaled or surpassed within the show's own history. To examine these episodes carefully is to understand both what the show was capable of at its best and why the decline, when it came, felt like a genuine loss rather than simply a change. You Only Move Twice, from Season 8, is often cited as the single greatest episode the show produced. The premise is that Homer receives a dream job offer from a company called Globex Corporation, and moves the family to a perfect planned community in the mountains. His new boss is a man named Hank Scorpio, who is charming and generous and completely supportive of Homer in ways that no employer in the Simpsons universe has ever been. Scorpio turns out to be a supervillain, running a massive terrorist operation from beneath the pleasant company town. Homer never notices. He is too happy doing his job well to look beneath the surface of where he's doing it. The episode works on multiple levels. It's a parody of James Bond films. It's a character study of what Homer could be when his environment actually supports him. It's a meditation on the bargains we make to get the professional satisfaction we want. The perfect job was always attached to something monstrous that you were simply choosing not to notice. And it ends with Homer returning to his previous life, having accidentally won an NFL team as a reward for his services, with the team's stadium already under construction on the property where a nice house used to be. Albert Brooks voiced Scorpio with an energy and specificity that has made the character one of the most beloved one-episode figures in the show's history. Scorpio is affectionate, enthusiastic, and completely transparent about being evil in ways that Homer finds easy to overlook. The performance is so committed that you understand why Homer, who has spent his career being ignored by his employer, found Scorpio's investment in him so completely disabling of his critical faculties. You two watching, find yourself liking Scorpio. You know he's wrong. You like him anyway. The Joy of Sect, from Season 9, is about Springfield's susceptibility to a cult. The movementarians arrive in town with a message about a perfect leader who will take the faithful to a paradise planet called Blistonia. The whole town joins except Marge, who organizes a counter-cult deprogramming effort. The episode is a sharp satire of how cults work, the specific techniques of sleep deprivation and repetition, and social isolation, and the gradual replacement of independent judgment with group consensus, are depicted with enough accuracy to be genuinely informative about the psychology of manipulation. And the episode understands that Springfield is not an especially susceptible town. All humans are susceptible to the right combination of promises and pressure, and the Simpsons are human in exactly the ways that make them susceptible. El viaje misterioso de nuestro Homer, from Season 8, sends Homer on a chili-induced spiritual journey through a surreal desert landscape where he encounters a coyote spirit guide voiced by Johnny Cash. The episode is hallucinatory in its visual ambition and surprisingly earnest in its emotional content. Homer is trying to understand whether Marge is truly his soulmate, whether the person you've built your life around is really the person who was meant to be there. The coyote tells him, in Cash's unmistakable voice, that only Homer can answer that. The answer he arrives at is a specific and beautiful thing. He builds a lighthouse to guide Marge to him. He doesn't pursue. He creates the conditions for being found, and she finds him. The Cartridge Family, from Season 9, handles the politics of gun ownership with a specificity that the show rarely brought to political subjects. Homer buys a gun. He loves the gun immediately and completely. He is irresponsible with it in ways that terrify Marge. The episode does not resolve into a simple anti-gun or pro-gun message. It instead follows the actual tension in its premise. A man who genuinely enjoys having a gun, whose enjoyment is genuine and comprehensible, in a household where that enjoyment creates real fear. The resolution involves Marge making a choice about what she can and cannot live with. It is one of the show's most honest pieces of political comedy because it refuses the easy position in either direction. What made the 2000s different? The transition from the 90s to the 2000s in The Simpsons is visible not in any single catastrophic moment, but in a gradual shift in what the show was willing to let its characters be. In the early seasons, the characters' failures were internal. Homer failed because of things inside Homer, specific psychological and cognitive limitations that the show had built with care. In the later seasons, the characters' failures increasingly became external, driven by the requirements of plot rather than by the characters' actual natures. This is a subtle difference but a consequential one. When Homer does something catastrophically wrong in Season 4, you understand why. The specific combination of impulsiveness and limited self-awareness and genuine love that produces the catastrophe is Homer. When Homer does something catastrophically wrong in Season 13, you sometimes feel that the show needed someone to do something catastrophically wrong, and Homer was available. The shift in the writing of Marge is perhaps most visible. In the early seasons, Marge's patient endurance of Homer's failures was portrayed as a genuine character trait with genuine roots. Her patience came from somewhere. It was earned by the story through the episodes that showed you where it came from and what it cost her. In the later seasons, Marge's patience sometimes reads as a narrative convenience, a way of resolving episodes that the show couldn't resolve any other way. She forgives because the episode needs to end. The show's relationship with celebrity in the later seasons is also different. We discussed how early guest appearances felt essential and specific. In the later seasons, celebrity appearances more often felt decorative. Famous people appeared because they were famous, and their presence generated attention that the show's diminished creative energy couldn't generate on its own. The guests were often willing and sometimes charming, but the integration of their presence into the story was less careful, less precise, less necessary than the best early appearances had been. These changes are not mysterious. They reflect the ordinary pressures of maintaining a weekly television show across 3 decades, with a rotating writing staff and a network that wanted the show to continue regardless of whether the conditions for its best work were present. The surprise is not that the show declined from its peak. The surprise is that it produced as much exceptional work as it did for as long as it did. The 2000s also brought the internet, which changed the show's relationship with its own history in ways that had no precedent. For the first time, every previous episode was accessible to comparison. Every current episode was immediately placed in the context of everything that had come before. Fans who had grown up with the early seasons could rewatch those episodes in sequence and arrive at precise claims about exactly where and how the show had changed. The critical infrastructure for evaluating the decline was built, in real time, by the fan community during the very years the decline was occurring. This created a feedback dynamic that the show had to navigate. It was being made in a context where its own history was continuously present and continuously invoked. The writers were making new episodes in the shadow of their predecessors' best work that the internet had canonized and made permanently accessible. This is a difficult creative environment. It produces either the paralysis of excessive self-consciousness or the liberation of deciding the comparison doesn't matter. The show has oscillated between these responses across the 2000s and into the current decade. The surprisingly good later episodes, against the narrative of decline, which is not wrong, but which can become totalizing if you let it. There are later Simpsons episodes that deserve to be held apart and named for their genuine quality. Holidays of Future Past, from Season 23, is a Christmas episode set 30 years in the future. It's one of the show's more sustained and emotionally ambitious flash-forward sequences, giving us grown versions of Bart and Lisa dealing with the specific difficulties of their adult lives, their children, their relationships, their ongoing negotiations with who they had been. The episode is genuinely moving in its treatment of Bart as a father, showing the specific way that people with Bart's history, the history of someone who was told consistently that he was headed for failure, can find themselves both failing and exceeding expectations simultaneously. The love in the episode is real, the comedy is real, and the emotional content is not undermined by the comedy or vice versa. Homer the Father, from Season 22, is a smaller episode that finds Homer genuinely funny again through the device of his obsession with a terrible 80s sitcom called Thicker Than Waters. The episode has a structure that feels like the early show, a specific comedic premise, developed with care, arriving at emotional content that earns its weight. It's not a great episode in the way that the great early episodes are great, but it is good in a way that later season episodes only intermittently manage to be, and its goodness is rooted in character, rather than in plot machinery. The episodes that work in the later seasons tend to share a quality. They found something small and specific and human in the characters, something that feels drawn from the same emotional source material as the early show, and they built around that small thing carefully. The late season episodes that don't work tend to share the opposite quality. They began with a plot and tried to find characters to inhabit it. The difference is exactly the difference between writing from the inside out and writing from the outside in. The show's best work, at any point in its run, came from the inside. Section 22. The language the show invented. Catchphrases and what they carry. The Simpsons has given the English language an enormous number of words and phrases that most speakers now use without knowing their origin. Doh, Homer's expression of frustrated self-recrimination, was added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2001. It is now used by millions of people who have never watched a Simpsons episode and who could not tell you where it came from. It simply is. It exists in the language the way any genuine expression of human frustration would exist, because it perfectly captures something real and previously unnamed. Meh, used to express indifference, has been attributed to The Simpsons for its popularization in the early 90s, though its origins are disputed. The specific tone of the word, that flat, deflating syllable that says, "I was not moved, and I am not pretending otherwise," matches something the show understood about the specific kind of disappointed expectation that modern life produces. The phrase "embiggens," used in the show as part of Springfield's town motto, has been used sincerely and ironically in various contexts since its appearance in Season 8. Cromulent, used in the same episode to describe embiggens as a perfectly cromulent word, has similarly found its way into genuine usage among people who know its origin. The episode that introduced both words, Lisa the Iconoclast, was making a joke about how words become legitimate through usage and authority, rather than through any inherent quality. The joke has since proved itself. The invented words from that episode are legitimate words now, having become so through exactly the process the episode was satirizing. The show's specific comedy voice, with its tendency toward precise absurdist escalation, and its simultaneous affection for, and distance from its own subject matter, has influenced the written style of an enormous number of people who grew up watching it. Writers who came of age in the 90s were, many of them, learning something about comic rhythm and the management of tone by watching The Simpsons every Sunday night. The show's influence on how comedy is written in English is difficult to quantify, but almost certainly more significant than the direct influence of any single author or publication from the same period. There is also the matter of the show's relationship with its own quotation. No show in television history has been as densely quoted as The Simpsons. Lines from the show exist in continuous active use, sometimes attributed, often not, deployed as cultural shorthand in conversations among people who may share nothing else in common, but the knowledge that a particular line is funny and applicable. This is the show's deepest cultural achievement. It did not simply produce comedy, it produced a shared vocabulary. The density of the show's quotability is related to a specific quality of its writing, a high joke-per-minute rate combined with a preference for complete, self-contained expressions over setups that depend on context. The best Simpsons lines work in isolation. You can quote them to someone who has never seen the episode, and they will still land because the line contains its whole joke within itself. Excellent. The very model of a modern major general. No, I said Doe. These things complete themselves. This is a specific craft achievement. Writing a line that is funny in context and also funny extracted from context requires understanding comedy at the level of sentence structure, rather than only at the level of situation. The Simpsons writers understood this, at their best, with a precision that has not been matched in American television comedy. Homer's names and what they mean. Burns cannot remember Homer's name. This is one of the show's most consistent running elements. Homer has worked at the plant for his entire adult life. Burns employs him directly. Burns has encountered Homer in personal contexts repeatedly, and Burns cannot reliably produce the name Homer Simpson when required. The show plays this for comedy with various frequency and uses it as a plot engine occasionally. 2. Burns's inability to remember the name of his safety inspector is simultaneously an indictment of Burns's regard for his employees, and a specific form of horror, the horror of being invisible to the person who holds your livelihood in their hands. But there is something else in this recurring element that rewards attention. Homer's full name is Homer J. Simpson. He was named by his creator after his creator's own father. His name is a real name, a name with history and meaning, the name of a Greek poet associated with foundational texts of Western literature, and the name of a man in Oregon who had a particular life and relationships and things he passed on to his children. When Burns cannot remember this name, when the show makes the forgetting a recurring joke, it is doing something that extends beyond comedy. It is depicting what happens when a person's specific, individual, named existence is absorbed by their institutional function. Homer is the safety inspector. He is Sector 7G. He is the body in the orange jumpsuit. His name, which carries his history and his specific selfhood, is not required information for the person who signs his checks. What is required is his functional role, and that role is maintained whether Burns knows the name or not. This is not a small thing. It is one of the show's most consistent pieces of commentary on what labor relations actually feel like from the inside of them. the experience of being necessary and invisible simultaneously. Homer matters to Burns as a function. He is irrelevant to him as a person. The confusion about his name is not cruelty. It is something worse. It is the accurate representation of how little the name matters to someone who sees only the function. Homer endures this for 36 years. He returns to work. He does his job imperfectly. He occasionally snaps and confronts Burns about it. And then he forgets, because Homer's capacity for sustained grievance is limited. And he goes back. And Burns still doesn't know his name. Section 23. The stories the show never told. What was pitched and rejected? The history of television is as much the history of what was rejected as what was made. For a show as long-running as The Simpsons, the archive of ideas that were proposed and then rejected or abandoned represents an enormous alternative show, a shadow version of Springfield that exists only in rooms where creative decisions were made. There are a few documented cases of story ideas that reached some stage of development before being set aside. One of the most discussed involves a proposed episode in which Springfield would be revealed to have a permanent cloud of nuclear contamination surrounding it, invisible to its residents, that functioned as a kind of force field preventing them from fully perceiving the reality of their situation. The idea was too close to the radiation theory we've discussed, and it would have required the show to commit to a canonical explanation for Springfield's reality that its creators were not willing to commit to. It was shelved. There were proposals, in the show's middle seasons, for a sustained multi-episode arc involving the Simpson family separating temporarily, Homer and Marge facing a genuine marital crisis that would take several episodes to resolve. This kind of serialized storytelling was unusual for American primetime comedy in the period when it was proposed. The idea would have required the audience to track a single storyline across multiple episodes rather than treating each episode as complete in itself. It was rejected on grounds that it would confuse the audience and create accessibility problems for casual viewers. The show remained episodic. There were episodes in early development that would have given major storylines to supporting characters in ways that the show eventually only managed in abbreviated form. A full episode centered on what Smithers's life looked like away from Burns, for instance, remained in the idea stage for many years, before partial versions of it were attempted in isolated moments rather than in a complete standalone story. The most interesting category of rejected ideas are the ones that would have permanently changed the show's reality. There are documented cases of proposals that would have aged the characters, even slightly. The suggestion that Bart might be 11 in one season was seriously considered and rejected on grounds that it would set a precedent for progression that the floating timeline couldn't accommodate. The decision not to age Bart is the decision that sealed the show's formal identity more than any other single choice. It committed the show to the eternal present. Every subsequent choice that maintained the eternal present was downstream of that one. What these rejected ideas collectively reveal is that the show's identity, its specific relationship to time and character development and serialized storytelling, was contested. These were decisions made by people in rooms. Decisions that could have gone differently. Decisions that would have produced a different show. The show that exists is one possible show that could have emerged from its premise. The shadow versions, the ones that aged Bart, that killed Marge, that committed to the radiation theory, that followed Smithers home, exist somewhere in the space of what was imagined and not made. This is not unique to The Simpsons. Every show is a selection from among possible shows. But The Simpsons, being long enough and influential enough to have generated substantial documentation of its own production history, gives us unusual visibility into the selection process. We can see the roads that were not taken. We can inhabit, briefly, the alternative Springfields that might have been. And then we return to the one that exists, with slightly more appreciation for the choices that made it what it is. The stories fans wrote instead. The fan fiction community around The Simpsons is one of the largest in American animation. Across several decades and multiple platforms, fans have been writing the stories the show did not tell, exploring the roads not taken, aging the characters, killing them, having them face consequences, letting them change in the ways the floating timeline prevented. The best fan fiction about The Simpsons tends to be the kind that takes the show's emotional premises seriously and follows them to conclusions the show couldn't reach. What would an adult Bart Simpson be? The show has glimpsed this in flash-forward episodes. Fan writers have explored it at length, with varying degrees of care. The most compelling versions tend to produce a Bart who has turned out to be something the show's eternal present couldn't quite contain. Complicated in his adulthood in the specific way that creative, chaotic children become complicated adults, carrying the energy of his youth into contexts that reward it and contexts that punish it, making choices that the show's reset button was preventing him from making. What would Lisa's career actually look like? Fan writers have imagined her as a journalist, a politician, a scientist, a musician, a lawyer, an activist. Each version extrapolates from something the show established in her character and follows it forward. The most interesting versions are not the ones that simply confirm Lisa's exceptional gifts, but the ones that reckon honestly with the costs of being Lisa. The loneliness, the difficulty of translating intelligence into effectiveness in systems built for something other than intelligence. The specific kind of isolation that comes from caring more deeply than the people around you. The fanfiction community is, in aggregate, a record of what the audience needed from the show that the show couldn't give. It is the stories that filled the emotional gaps, the consequences that the reset button erased, the developments that the floating timeline prevented. It is Springfield allowed to change. It is the characters allowed to grow, and it exists alongside the show itself, as a kind of parallel Springfield, accessed through different means, produced for different reasons, but drawing from the same source material, and the same investment, and the same love of a family on a couch in a town that doesn't quite exist. The fan fiction didn't replace the show, it completed it, in the specific way that things that are loved by more people than can be satisfied by one object get completed by the love itself, by all the stories that love generates when the official story isn't enough. Coda, the last thing the show taught me. There is something The Simpsons understands about time that I have been circling throughout this entire journey without quite naming it directly, and I want to name it now, at the end, because it is perhaps the most generous thing the show has done for the people who've spent time in Springfield. Time is the thing you cannot stop losing. Every experience you have is already becoming a memory as you have it. The present is never quite present. It is always becoming past, always slipping away, always moving from the category of what is happening into the category of what happened. And most of the time, there is nothing you can do about this. The natural direction of time is forward. Things end. People leave. Children grow up and stop being the specific children you knew and become different. Larger people who contain the children inside them but are no longer identical to them. The Simpsons decided not to participate in this. It decided that its family would remain in the same moment, that the present would never become past for them, that Bart would be 10, and Lisa would be 8, and Homer would come home from work, and the couch would be there, always, and nothing would be lost, because nothing would change enough to lose. This is a fantasy. Everyone knows it's a fantasy. The show knows it's a fantasy, and some of its deepest comedy comes from knowing this and depicting it anyway. But the fantasy serves something real. It serves the human need to have a place where time does not move. A place you can return to that will be the same as it was when you left it. A place where the people you love are always the age they were when you first loved them, and the house is always the house it was, and the couch is still warm. Most people cannot have this in their actual lives. Families grow and change and eventually become different configurations of people than they were. Children leave. Parents age. The houses of childhood are sold or renovated or demolished. The specific version of your family that existed when you were 8 years old no longer exists anywhere except in memory, which is imperfect and unstable and gradually rewrites itself. But in Springfield, that version exists. It is preserved completely. It runs every week in the same form it has always been in, with the same people in the same house, doing the same things. And nothing is different, and nothing is lost, and the fantasy is available to anyone who turns it on. That is what the show was for. That is the bottom of the iceberg. That is the thing you find when you go all the way down. The Simpsons was always a gift to the people who needed a place where things stayed the same, where the family held, where Homer came home, where the beer was cold and the couch was warm and the kids were always young and the story never ended. It is still that gift. Every episode, every rerun, every time you sit down and the theme plays and Springfield scrolls by and the family rushes to the couch and lands there. Together. One more time. One more time. And then again. And again. Because in Springfield, there is always one more time. That's all. That's everything. Sleep well. Supplemental section. The supporting cast as a portrait of a town. Apu and the question of representation. Apu Nahasapima Pedalon ran the Quickie Mart for 28 years of the show's run. He was, in that time, one of the most prominent South Asian characters in American primetime television, which is itself a fact worth sitting with. A character running a convenience store in a cartoon was, for a significant period, one of the more visible representations of South Asian life in American popular culture. The bar was that low. The character was written with warmth and complexity across many appearances. Apu had a backstory. He had a doctorate in computer science from the Calcutta Institute of Technology. He had ambitions that extended beyond the Quickie Mart. He had a family, an arranged marriage that became a genuine love story, 8 children born in one episode, parents with specific characters, a community of faith. The show gave him more than a stereotype. It gave him specificity. And it also gave him the stereotype. The accent was exaggerated. The cultural coding was consistent with certain expectations. The humor associated with him drew on his foreignness in ways that were standard for the period's comedy, but that, when examined in aggregate over 28 years, represented a consistent reduction of South Asian identity to a single comedic register. The conversation that emerged around Apu in the late 2000s, and that became more public around 2017, was not about whether the character had any positive qualities. He clearly did. It was about whether the cumulative effect of a character whose most prominent feature was a performed accent and a cultural positioning as fundamentally other, different, and comedically foreign, was harmful to South Asian viewers who had few other representations to point to. The harm of representation isn't always in individual moments, it accumulates. The show's eventual response, Azaria's departure from the role, and Apu's reduced presence, represented an institutional acknowledgement that the question was worth taking seriously. What the character's future holds, whether he is recast or simply retired, is part of the ongoing story of what the show is willing to be as American ideas about representation and diversity continue to evolve. What Apu's story also represents, in the broader context of this exploration, is the way the show was always a product of specific historical and cultural conditions. It was made by specific people, in specific rooms, at specific moments in American cultural history. The choices those people made reflected what was possible, and what was acceptable, and what was assumed in those rooms at those moments. Some of those choices have aged well, some have not. The honest accounting of the show's legacy requires holding both categories simultaneously. Sideshow Bob's family, the Turwilligers as a unit. When Sideshow Bob returned for a later season episode set in Italy, he was accompanied by his wife Francesca and his son Bart, named in an act of either deeply misguided sentimentality or very specific psychological complexity, after the child he had spent his adult life attempting to murder. The introduction of the Turwilliger family as a unit added a dimension to Bob's character that the show had not previously explored. Francesca is a woman of formidable practical intelligence who sees Bob clearly and loves him anyway, which is either admirable or concerning depending on your perspective. She has no apparent connection to his criminal history, or she has accepted it as one accepts other hereditary conditions in a partner, unfortunate but not disqualifying. She wants a good life for her family. She wants their son to have opportunities. She is, in the practical specifics of their daily existence, the more competent half of the partnership. Young Bart Turwilliger inherits his father's intelligence and his mother's practicality in a combination that produces someone who is, at age 8, already somewhat frightening. He approaches violence with the same dispassion he brings to everything else. He has, on occasion, attempted to assist his father's murder plots with an enthusiasm that reflects well on his commitment to family values, if not on his moral development. The Turwilliger family is, when the show uses them well, a portrait of what Bob might have been if his enormous gifts had been directed toward something other than patrician grievance and theatrical villainy. They are a functional family unit. They love each other. They have dinner together. They navigate the specific difficulties of being the Turwilligers, which include Bob's intermittent returns to attempted murder and his inevitable recapture and imprisonment. Francesca handles these episodes with the weary efficiency of someone who has learned to update her contingency plans regularly. What these characters add to the Springfield mythology is the reminder that even the show's most theatrical villains are human beings with relationships and histories and people who depend on them. Bob is not simply a villain. He is a husband and a father and a man with genuine aesthetic gifts and genuine psychological damage and a name written on a birth certificate somewhere. A name that his own father gave him for reasons lost to the show's history. He is a person. Springfield is full of people. That is the show's most consistent and most important observation about the world it depicts. Principal Skinner/Armin Tamzarian in full. We discussed the Principal and the Pauper episode earlier, in the context of Springfield's collective denial. But the character himself, in both of his identities, deserves a closer look, because the show built something over 8 seasons before it revealed that what it had built was a fiction, and the fictionality does not actually erase what was built. The man the town calls Seymour Skinner is a specific kind of person. He is someone who came from nothing, who built an identity for himself through service and responsibility, and the kind of steady, unglamorous competence that institutions require to function, and who has maintained that identity through sheer determination for 20 years. He loves his mother. Even though his relationship with Agnes Skinner is one of the show's most claustrophobic domestic portraits, he is devoted to the school despite being hamstrung by inadequate resources and an impossible mandate. He is patient with Bart in ways that suggest genuine belief in the redemptive potential of persistence. All of this is true about Armin Tamzarian. Every quality that Principal Skinner had in the 8 seasons before the reveal, those qualities belong to Tamzarian. He built them. He earned them. The name he borrowed belonged to someone else, but the character he made under that name was his. This is why the episode's ending, in which the town votes to restore Tamzarian to the Skinner identity and banish the real Skinner, is not entirely comedic in its logic. Yes, it's absurd. Yes, the judge issuing a decree that forbids acknowledging the truth is a satire of how communities maintain comfortable fictions, but it is also, if you hold it sideways, a recognition that identity is made through action over time, rather than through documentation. The man who spent 20 years being a principal is more a principal than the man who has the name on the birth certificate but was absent for 20 years of what that name was becoming. The show makes this argument comically, which is the Simpsons way, but the argument is there, and it connects to something the show has always believed about its characters, that they are who they have been across hundreds of episodes, and that what happens in any single episode, however dramatic, is in conversation with all of that accumulated history. Tamzarian is Skinner because Springfield made him Skinner. And Springfield made him Skinner because he showed up and did the work, and built something real out of a borrowed name. The very last layer, notes on watching in the dark. There is a particular way of watching The Simpsons that produces a different experience from watching it in any other condition. You have to be tired. Not exhausted in a way that prevents engagement, but softened by the hour, by the day behind you, by the specific vulnerability that comes when the day's armor is down, and the night is quiet, and the world has contracted to the size of a screen in a dark room. In that state, the show gives you something it doesn't give you in the afternoon. The comedy is still there. The timing is still precise. The jokes still land. But underneath the comedy, in the space between lines, in the stillness of the camera, when it holds on a character's face for a beat, before the next joke arrives, you can hear the show's real frequency. The frequency is this: you are going to be okay. Not because everything will work out. Not because the problems you're carrying will resolve themselves. Not because you are strong enough or smart enough or prepared enough for what comes next. But because there is a couch in Springfield, and the family is on it, and Homer is coming home, and Marge is there, and the kids are young, and the beer is cold, and whatever happens tomorrow, tonight this exists, and it is yours. That is a small promise. It is the smallest kind of promise. A cartoon family in a town that doesn't exist on any map, telling you that the world will hold through the next 22 minutes. And then, if you stay, through the 22 minutes after that. The show has been making that promise since December 17, 1989. It has made it thousands of times. And the people who come back to it, who return to Springfield in the late-night hours when the day has been too much, are returning because the promise is kept. Every time. The family is still there. The couch is still warm. The theme is playing. That is the iceberg, all the way to the bottom. The theories and the history and the production secrets and the real tragedies, and the cultural influence, and the language the show invented, and the stories it told, and the stories it couldn't tell. All of it resting on this one small, consistent promise. You are welcome here. The door is always open. Come home whenever you need to. Springfield will be waiting. End of script. Total runtime approximately 4 to 5 hours of narration. Appendix. The details that don't fit anywhere else. Hans Molman and the body count revisited. We talked about Hans Molman earlier in the context of what his repeated deaths mean under different theoretical frameworks. But there's one more dimension to him that is worth adding. His age. The show has stated, directly and on camera, that Hans Molman is 31 years old. 31. And yet he appears to be somewhere in his late 80s, bent and nearly blind, and moving with the specific gait of someone whose body has been fighting a war against gravity for several decades. Something happened to Hans Molman. Something aged him decades past his actual years. And the show, which is very good at not answering its own questions, has never explained what. The radiation theory accounts for this. Sustained exposure to nuclear contamination can produce accelerated aging at the cellular level. The coma theory accounts for it differently. Homer's dream version of Hans Molman reflects Homer's subconscious sense of him as extremely old, regardless of actual chronology. But there is a third reading that has nothing to do with either theory. Hans Molman is a portrait of what pure bad luck looks like across a life. He has no protective factors. He has no Burns-level wealth to insulate him from consequence, no Simpsons-level family warmth to sustain him, no Ned Flanders-level faith to organize his suffering. He simply exists in Springfield, absorbing what Springfield dishes out, and what Springfield dishes out has been, for Molman, catastrophic. He has been hit by cars and crushed by objects, and struck by lightning, and bitten by animals and buried alive. He has experienced the full force of a universe that does not weight outcomes toward the deserving. And he keeps showing up, bent, nearly blind, 31 years old and looking 80. He keeps appearing in the background of Springfield scenes. He keeps surviving the unsurvivable and turning up in the next episode ready to encounter the next disaster. Hans Molman is, in this reading, the most honest character in Springfield. Not the most complex, not the most sympathetically drawn, not the most fully developed, but the most honest about what it costs to simply continue. He continues. That's his whole thing. Whatever happens, whatever kills him, he continues. And the show never explains why. It just keeps showing him alive. There is something in that, if you sit with it. The opening credits in full. The opening credits of The Simpsons are technically among the most analyzed 30 seconds of animation ever produced, but they contain details that even devoted viewers sometimes miss. Bart's chalkboard punishment changes every episode. The school dismissal bell rings, and Bart skateboards through a neighborhood that changes subtly between seasons. Homer is almost run over by Marge's car as he backs out of the power plant. He runs across the street with his radiation rod, which he drops down his shirt collar. This detail, Homer taking radioactive material home in his clothing, happening in the credits of every single episode of the show, is either a consistent visual joke or the credits' way of reminding you, every episode, of the radiation theory's central mechanism. The contamination comes home. It always came home. Lisa is chased out of band practice for playing a jazz solo that exceeds the teacher's expectations or tolerance, depending on how you read it. The nature of what she plays and why she's dismissed from the room is the opening credits' compressed version of Lisa's entire relationship with a world that can't quite accommodate what she is. Maggie is scanned at the checkout, at a price that communicates whatever the show wants to communicate about her value. She is almost left at the store when Marge drives away, before she's been secured in the car. Homer grabs her at the last moment. The family arrives home and rushes to the couch, and then something happens. Whatever the couch gag is that week happens, and then the show begins. The credits are a compressed version of the show's emotional and thematic content. The chalkboard is Bart's ongoing, unresolvable conflict with authority. The band room is Lisa's ongoing, unresolvable conflict with a world too small for her gifts. Maggie's near abandonment and recovery is the show's ongoing meditation on how easy it is to almost lose the thing you love most when you're not paying attention. Homer, bringing the radioactive rod home in his collar, is the show's ongoing commitment to showing you exactly how the contamination works, while making it easy to overlook. Every episode, before the story begins, the show tells you its story. It has been telling it in exactly this format for 36 years. The only thing that changes is the couch. Springfield's 7 Wonders. Springfield has, across 36 years of episodes, accumulated an infrastructure of famous local landmarks that have become as recognizable to devoted viewers as real city's actual attractions. Each of these landmarks carries its own history and its own significance in the show's mythology. The tire fire has been burning for an unspecified number of years, in a lot near the edge of town. Nobody knows exactly when it started. Nobody has successfully extinguished it. It burns steadily, producing a column of black smoke that is visible in various establishing shots of Springfield over the years. The tire fire is Springfield's most honest landmark. Most cities have something like it, an ongoing problem that has persisted long enough to become infrastructure, a difficulty that has been accepted rather than solved because solving it would require more sustained attention than the community can currently organize. Springfield's tire fire is just more literal than most. The Springfield Gorge is the gorge that Homer famously fails to jump across on a skateboard in an episode whose reputation has grown considerably over the years. He makes the attempt. He falls. He is brought back up by an ambulance that crashes and sends him back down the gorge. He lands at the bottom a second time. The whole sequence is one of the show's most extended pieces of physical comedy, a sustained meditation on what it means to attempt something impossible, and then suffer the consequences not once but twice. Shelbyville, the neighboring town to Springfield, functions in the show's mythology as Springfield's foil and rival. There is a specific historical grievance between the two towns, established in an episode that revealed the towns were founded by two men who disagreed about whether first cousins should be allowed to marry. Shelbyville was founded by the man who believed they should. Springfield was founded by the man who was horrified by this idea. The towns have been in cultural competition since. Shelbyville is Springfield seen from a slightly different angle. Similar enough to be recognizable, different enough to produce the specific kind of resentment that only near neighbors generate. These landmarks, and the dozens of others that populate Springfield's geography, are part of what makes the town feel real to its viewers. A fictional town with a tire fire and a gorge and a neighboring rival has the texture of a place that existed before the story started, and will exist after it ends. Springfield is not a backdrop. It is, in the cumulative construction of 36 seasons, a place. Its reality is entirely fictional and entirely genuine.